For nearly 15 years, I've walked these grounds beneath every kind of sky, from the crisp clarity of winter moons to the humid, heavy black of August storms. The cemetery, like any patch of old American soil, has its language coyotes wailing in the woods, a passing train's distant whistle, sometimes the click of a marble, or the cry of a mourning dove lost in the stones. But never the church bell. Not once in all those years had the bell in the old brick tower sounded outside a funeral. Its rope was frayed, its mouth caked in dust, and nobody but the odd lost child or stray cat ever even looked at it anymore. That's why, when the deep, iron-heavy toll shook me awake at 2:27 a.m., I thought for a moment it was a dream. The sound traveled differently than I remembered from daytime ceremonies. It seemed to vibrate through my bones, pulse in the walls, even in the teeth of my comb on the dresser. I lay there with my heart pounding, counting the seconds after the echo died, waiting for another strike, but the silence only grew thicker. At dawn, the cemetery was as unchanged as ever. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been near the tower, not even a shift in the dew on the grass. I asked old Frank, who sometimes swept the chapel, but he only shrugged and said maybe I'd heard a car door slamming in the night. I tried to put it out of my mind. It wasn't until lunchtime that the news came. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Ruth Ellis, had passed in her sleep. Her son found her just after sunrise. They said it was peaceful, just her heart giving out, nothing out of the ordinary for a woman in her 80s. Except I couldn't help but check the time, 2:27 a.m., that exact hour listed on the paramedics report. I went cold. There are coincidences in this business, more than most want to believe, but I'd never had one so precise, so chilling. That night I found myself staring out the window at the bell tower, its black outline against the sky, daring it to move. And I told myself, just once, that was all it was. But the next night, just after 3, it rang again, clear, deep, one solemn note that turned my veins to ice. The next morning, word came from down the road. Another death, a quiet one, an old man who kept mostly to himself. The time on the official record matched the hour of the bell. 2 nights, 2 tolls, 2 souls gone from the world. The pattern was impossible to ignore. I began keeping a log by the bed, pencil sharpened, ready to note the time, the sound, the feeling. With each new toll, the hairs on my arms stood up, as if the sound was not coming from outside at all, but rising from the hollow places inside my chest. And each morning, another call, another loss, always marked down in the record books at the very moment the bell had broken the silence. I couldn't say anything to the neighbors without sounding like I'd lost my mind, so I kept it to myself, growing more and more aware that in these old places, some things simply refused to sleep quietly. The days blurred together, the tension ratcheting with every sunset, as if the air itself expected the bell to sound again. I stopped pretending to sleep. Instead, I sat upright in my battered armchair, with the window cracked just enough to let in the night. The bell's tower loomed through the glass, black and skeletal against the starlit sky, and I waited, not even sure for what confirmation, perhaps, that the world followed rules stranger than any we wrote down. The next time it rang, the clock read 1:58 a.m., and I knew, before the echo faded, that somewhere a life was ending. My journal soon filled with neat little notes, each line a grim equation: bell, time, name, cause of death. It didn't matter if the person was young or old, sick or healthy, expected or not. The bell became a harbinger, impartial and inevitable, ringing out for deaths natural, accidental, and once, God help me, by violence, a local boy in a car accident, his mother's wail still echoing in my mind long after the bell had fallen silent. I started to dread the nighttime, dreading not just the toll itself, but the silence that followed, heavy and knowing, a kind of waiting that pressed against my ribs and made my heart beat harder. It wasn't superstition, not anymore. I had proof, pages and pages of it, a private ledger of the line between the living and the dead. Once, I tried to ignore it, left the window shut, played the radio loud, but the bell still cut through low, insistent, impossible to forget. On the nights it didn't ring, I found myself pacing the house, waiting for a sound that never came, my nerves raw and fraying. The bell had become an unwanted companion, marking time with the end of other people's stories. Neighbors began to whisper. They noticed me checking my watch after each ring, heard my questions about the exact time of passing. Some joked about the grim bell or the curse of St. Agnes Tower, but I saw how they watched the chapel now, side-eye glances on morning walks, crossing themselves when they thought nobody looked. The only person who seemed unfazed was old Frank, who shrugged off every mention, claiming the dead always find their bell, one way or another. The pattern solidified. The bell always tolled a few minutes before death, never after, never for anything else. I began to wonder, was it calling death, or simply warning of its approach? The question haunted me as much as the sound itself, and I realized I was waiting for the night when the bell would ring for someone I knew, or worse, for myself. That night, the sky was choked with fog so dense the chapel tower was barely a suggestion, a blur where it should have stood crisp against the moonlight. I'd been up since dusk, pacing between windows, unable to shake the sense that something waited just beyond the reach of my porch light. The air was oddly warm for autumn, a kind of heat that pressed in and made my shirt cling to my skin. When the bell rang out at 3:07 a.m., I nearly dropped the coffee mug in my hand. One toll, heavy as always. My heart froze. But then, without warning, it struck again too, then a third time, perfectly spaced, as deliberate as the seconds ticking off a countdown. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, as if the world itself had drawn in a lungful of air and refused to exhale. I scrawled the time and number in my notebook, underlining it twice, hands shaking. 3 rings, but no phone calls from the police, no ambulance sirens splitting the dark, no knocks at my door from neighbors clutching news of some terrible event. Sunrise brought only an eerie quiet. The usual chatter at the bakery was hushed, the usual gossip traded for nervous glances at the chapel hill. I called the hospital, checked the obituary hotline, even walked to the old folks' home. Nothing. No deaths, no accidents, no crisis in the night. The feeling that settled over me wasn't relief, but a prickling anxiety that had no place to settle, as if the deaths had happened, but gone unrecorded, left wandering. I tried to convince myself it was a mechanical error, a gust of wind, some trick of the ancient iron in the tower, but the bell had never malfunctioned before, never rang without purpose. That day, I wandered the cemetery, eyes burning, scanning for any sign of something missed. It was then I noticed something that sent a cold shiver straight through me. 3 graves, side by side, older than any of the others, and everyone disturbed, the soil loose and uneven as if freshly turned, though no one had worked there in years. No markers stood on those mounds, no flowers, no names. But I knew, with a certainty deeper than bone, that those were the ones for whom the bell had tolled. Not for the living, but for those who should never have left the earth. Sleep abandoned me after that discovery. I scoured the records, rummaging through brittle, yellowed logbooks stacked in the back office pages, written in looping script by hands that trembled as much as mine now did. The names for those 3 unmarked graves were missing, entire entries skipped or scratched out, as if someone had tried to erase their existence from memory itself. Even the oldest caretakers, men and women whose entire lives had been stitched to the rhythm of the graveyard, could only shake their heads when I pointed toward those mounds. Always been there, one muttered, his voice thick with caution. But I couldn't tell you who's down in the earth. No one could. It was as if those plots belonged to shadows, claimed by the cemetery, but never claimed by grief or kin. Determined, I turned to the town's archive, leafing through fading newspaper clippings and death notices from decades past. That's when I found the story, a small article from half a century ago about 3 townsfolk lost in a flood. The river had risen without warning, sweeping away homes and hopes and bodies alike. Only 2 were recovered, the rest presumed claimed by the current. No funerals, no farewells. The names were there, faded but legible, and as I read them aloud in the empty records room, the lights flickered, as if stirred by the sound. Their faces stared back at me from a photograph, printed on the back page, unsmiling, eyes sharp, as if daring the world to forget them. A chill ran through me as I realized the bell must have been tolling for these lost souls, not to announce a death, but to mark the absence that still haunted the ground. Every cemetery has its secrets, every town its stories half told, but this was different, a wound left open, refusing to close. When I returned to the cemetery that evening, I paused at those mounds, listening for anything that might break the hush of dusk. The silence was so profound it rang in my ears, but there was something else too, barely perceptible, a gentle shuffling, like earth settling, or perhaps something beneath it stirring. The names lingered on my tongue, the faces burned into my mind. I understood now why the bell had rung 3 times with no deaths to count. The dead were missing, and the earth itself was still waiting for them to return. The unease clung to me through the following night, like a second skin, every footstep across the cemetery grounds sending a jolt of cold up my spine. I tried to bury myself in routine, sweeping leaves, checking locks, pretending the ordinary would drown out the dread. But the cemetery felt changed, older, heavier, as if each grave had begun to breathe quietly in the dark. The bell tower, once just another fixture against the sky, loomed now with an unnatural weight. I watched it from my office window, expecting nothing and everything at once. And then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., a single peal rang out deep, metallic, vibrating through my bones. I bolted upright, pulse thudding in my ears, and ran to the tower. My breath formed clouds in the chill, though the night was unseasonably warm. The rope hung slack, swaying as if it had just been pulled by an unseen hand. When I looked closer, I saw fresh marks carved into the old wood of the bell. 4 names, the 3 from the newspaper, and etched only hours old my own, letters still raw as if cut by a trembling blade. I traced my name with a shaking finger, the ink of fear blooming beneath my skin. The others were gone, their graves still empty, and now it seemed I had joined their unfinished story. The cemetery was silent, except for the low moan of wind. But as I turned back to the grounds, I saw movement figures slipping among the stones. Indistinct at first, then clearer in the cold moonlight. They walked slowly, as if uncertain of their own bodies, their outlines shifting between what was living and what had long been lost. I recognized them from the photograph, and in the instant their gazes met mine, I felt something open in my chest, a sudden, shattering understanding that the bell was not only a harbinger of death, but a summons for those who could not rest, for the souls who had never been properly mourned, for anyone whose name was etched into the wood. In the following days, I tried to warn others, to show the names, to prove the bell's message, but the marks would fade by morning, the ropes go still, and my words wither in skeptical air. Yet every night I returned, listening for the bell, watching for shadows that did not belong to the living. I knew then that one night the bell would toll for me, and no one would answer. I had become part of the story, another name for the bell, another walker in the dark, bound to the ground where the dead and the living cross paths beneath the indifferent stars. Story 2. He'd passed by the painting for decades, that dust-mottled group portrait hanging above the battered oak credenza in the administrative hallway. 100 years of funerary pride. The founding faces of Hollow Pines mortuary, fixed in sepia oil, their eyes dulled by time, their hands folded in proper Victorian reserve. It was easy to ignore, as any old artifact becomes invisible with routine. But lately, the Coviro gravedigger, caretaker, night watchman all rolled into one found himself glancing up each Monday morning, as if some nameless part of him waited for a difference he could not name. It began small, so small that for weeks he doubted his own mind. a brooch shifting from one collar to another, a signet ring appearing on a different finger, a cracked window in the painted background mended or missing. But soon, it was impossible to deny. Faces seemed to multiply at the painting's edges first, as half-formed shadows, then as blurred but recognizable features pressed among the original subjects. The group's composition subtly swelled. A portly woman in a mourning hat, who he could have sworn wasn't there a week ago, now stood to the left of the main figure, her expression one of tired worry, and further back, a younger man with wire spectacles leaned against the doorframe, his lips curved in a secretive smile. Once, early in the morning after a particularly cold night, he paused in front of the painting and counted 36 faces, where he remembered maybe 27 at the start of spring. He ran his finger along the bottom edge, where the paint was raised and peeling, searching for initials or a date, anything to tether the shifting image to reality. Sometimes a face that should have been familiar from the past would look back at him with a gaze that almost seemed aware, like the eyes in old portraits that followed your steps around a room, except now it felt like they sometimes blinked. He started testing himself, making sketches of the painting from memory at night and comparing them to the real thing the next day, convinced he'd catch his own mind in a trick. But the sketches never matched, and each time he stood before the painting, he noticed something new: a child's hand clutching a father's sleeve, a boutonniere budding on a lapel that had been bare, lips reshaped into a half-smile. No one else seemed to care. The new manager dismissed it as old paint and bad lighting. The day staff barely registered it at all. Only the Coviro seemed to feel the slow creep of the crowd within the canvas, the way the background grew busier, more flowers on the painted table, more coffins on the display rack in the corner. Sometimes he thought he heard whispers when he stood in front of the painting alone at night, voices layered and indistinct, speaking of anniversaries, of final processions, of names he recognized from dusty ledgers in the mortuary archives. He knew, with the kind of certainty that slips into a man's bones late in life, that the painting was alive in a way that had nothing to do with art. It was keeping a record, not just of the dead, but of everyone who ever worked these halls. And week by week, it waited to add one more. It became a ritual. Those early Mondays, before the rest of the world stirred, he'd pour himself a mug of burnt coffee, shuffle down the dimly lit corridor, and pause before the painting to scan the faces. One week, the change was unmistakable. A new face, pale and thin-lipped, hovered at the edge of the group. The Coviro felt his pulse quicken, for he knew that face. It belonged to Esther Randall, the embalmer who'd retired just 2 months earlier. The likeness was uncanny, not just in the set of the jaw or the curve of her brow, but in the haunted look she sometimes wore on difficult mornings, the sadness tucked at the corner of her mouth. He stepped back, recalling the day Esther had left, her goodbyes brief, her eyes already distant. There was no photograph of her in the office, no tribute pinned to the break-room wall. Yet here she was, rendered in oils, immortalized among the founders. As the weeks passed, more faces joined the gathering. Ray, the old groundskeeper who vanished after a snowstorm, stood next to a woman in a nurse's uniform who died long before the Coviro started working here. He recognized Harold from accounting, slumped awkwardly as if trying to disappear into the background. The painting style never faltered. The new additions blended perfectly with the aged brushwork, the palette just slightly darker, as if each new figure was caught in a deeper shadow. He started making lists, cross-checking rosters and obituaries, but it didn't matter. Every time someone left the mortuary, whether by death, retirement, or simply moving on, their face would emerge in the painting days later, always in the same muted tones, always staring just past his shoulder. He showed it to others, tried to explain the changes, but the responses were always the same. It's always looked like that, or you're seeing things. That painting's ancient. Even photographs where no help the snapshots he took showed the old, familiar faces, never the new ones he saw with his own eyes. It became clear that the painting was for him alone, or at least only those who'd worked long enough and buried enough secrets, could see it shift. He wondered if, one day, he would look up and see only strangers, or worse, find himself standing there, trapped forever among the company of the dead. He grew obsessed, drawn back to the painting at every odd hour, each glance tinged with dread and reluctant curiosity. He counted faces, searching for patterns. Had they moved? Had anyone faded or sharpened overnight? It became clear there was a quiet correlation between the faces in the painting and the empty seats in the break room. Whenever a coworker failed to return, sometimes after an illness, other times for reasons no one could quite explain, he'd wait, and inevitably, their likeness would emerge in the painting, as if the canvas absorbed them the moment they slipped from the living world. The funeral home took on a strange vacancy, its routines hollowed by absence, the laughter in the halls replaced by whispers, and the shuffle of paperwork. Sometimes he'd pass a closed office door and wonder if the person behind it was truly gone or just forgotten by everyone. But the portrait, one stormy evening, caught by insomnia, he walked the corridor, flashlight in hand, compelled to see if the storm had changed anything in the frame. As the weak beam danced over the painted surface, his heart seized. On the edge of the group, barely sketched among the shadows, he caught a glimpse of something he'd never seen before. A jawline, a familiar chin, the early suggestion of his own brow and nose, as if someone had begun to paint him into the gathering. He reached out, fingertips trembling, half expecting the oil to smear, but the paint was bone dry and cold to the touch. The Coviro stumbled back, the chill not just from the building's draft, but from the certainty that he was being claimed. From that night on, he checked daily for changes, hoping the sketch would vanish, that he could undo whatever fate was being recorded in pigment. But the shape grew more defined with each passing weak cheekbones, hair, a crease beside the eye he knew was his own, until there was no denying that he was slowly being immortalized, even as his colleagues stopped noticing his presence, their eyes sliding past him as if he were already half memory, half ghost. Restless and half haunted, the Coviro began to investigate the origins of the portrait. He had seen the signature small, curling, sepia tone pressed into the canvas's bottom right corner since his first days at the funeral home, but he'd never thought to look closer. Now, as he peered at the faded name beneath the varnish, he realized it was not merely the name of the artist, but also a former director of the home, a man spoken of in old meeting notes but never seen in person. Records in the dusty basement archives revealed more. A black and white photograph of the director, standing straight-backed, eyes empty, with his hand resting on the same frame that now hung on the wall. The photo showed fewer faces in the painting, and the director's own likeness was present, painted with uncanny precision. As the Coviro flipped through brittle pages and yellowed employee logs, a pattern formed. Every long-serving worker, every assistant and caretaker who had vanished or died, had their name first appear in the payroll, then in the painting, and finally vanish from every other record, as if the portrait itself kept the only true census of the dead. What chilled him most was the final entry in the log, a note from the director, written in hurried, jagged script. When your face appears, the halls begin to empty. The painting remembers what the world forgets. The Coviro stared at the director's painted smile, suddenly sure that the portrait was less a memorial than a ledger, an eternal accounting of everyone who had ever worked those midnight shifts among the dead. And with each name added, each brushstroke set, the painting seemed to grow a little heavier on the wall, as if carrying the weight of souls who could not leave, whose memories were kept alive only by the haunted gaze of oil and canvas. He knew then that unless he could stop the painting, he would be remembered forever, trapped with those who had come before, a secret kept behind the closed doors of a place where the living and the dead mingled only in silence and art. With every passing day, the portrait seemed to watch him more intently. The brushwork on the far right corner, where an indistinct blur had once rested, now revealed the faintest outline of his own face. It began subtly, almost like a trick of dust or light, the shape of a jaw he recognized from the mirror, a glint at the edge of a familiar eye, The stoop of his shoulders barely suggested in shadow. The Coviro tried everything to halt the progress. He moved the painting to storage, covered it with sheets, even petitioned the current director to have it professionally restored or removed, citing superstitions and the odd disappearances that so often followed its updating. But each night, no matter where he hid it, the portrait returned to the wall in the administration office, uncovered and as vivid as ever. He began to wake from anxious, tangled dreams, sweating and breathless, the image of his unfinished face pressing behind his eyes. Desperation mounting, he brought a palette knife to the canvas and scraped at the corner in the early hours before sunrise. For a moment, his reflection vanished, relief flooding him. Yet by the next evening, the face had returned more complete than before, as if the painting fed off his resistance, immortalizing his struggle alongside the others. He tried to rally his colleagues, but found their memories of the portrait unreliable. Some could not recall their own faces on the canvas. Others remembered coworkers who never existed at all. Alone, he watched as stroke by stroke, his features sharpened, the lines of age around his mouth, the fleck of gray at his temple, the unmistakable sadness that crept into his eyes. On the night his face finally appeared, rendered with a clarity that no camera could match, he felt a coldness descend on the office. The hallway behind him stretched out, empty and echoing, and the voices of the past, those whose faces peered silently from the painted crowd, seemed to whisper his name, welcoming him to join their silent vigil. From then on, every time he glanced at the portrait, he no longer saw himself as a caretaker of the dead, but as another soul preserved within its haunted assembly, watched, remembered, and never truly allowed to leave. Story 3. There is a particular bench at the cemetery's main gate, a rough old plank of dark wood, polished by decades of use, that's never cold, not in the blackest night, nor on the frost-bitten mornings when every tombstone glistens with a sheet of ice and the tools left out overnight freeze to the touch. The other benches along the gravel path are stiff and frigid by sunrise, but this one, nestled in the shade of a leafless sycamore, seems to hold the memory of summer in its fibers. The veteran gravedigger, who has walked these grounds every winter for over 20 years, never really thought much about the bench until that year. The snow never seemed to stop falling, and the wind rattled the window panes of the office like someone knocking to be let in. One morning, as he paused to sip his coffee from a chipped thermos, he reached down absent-mindedly and set his hand on the bench and felt a gentle, unmistakable warmth, as if the wood itself were alive. He mentioned it to the other workers, half expecting laughter or a dismissive wave, but instead they just shrugged, eyes drifting away, muttering that it was tradition to sit there, to listen to the silence before the day began. When he pressed for more, asked why no one talked about it, the older men would simply move on to another topic or find an excuse to leave. In the beginning, he wrote it off as one more harmless oddity in a place full of them, like the headless statue that always pointed west, or the old bell that rang sometimes for no reason at all. Still, he found himself returning to that bench each morning, drawn by its strange defiance of the cold and the way the wind seemed to hush around it, as if the very air was holding its breath. Sometimes, while sitting with his gloves off, the warmth would travel up his arms and into his chest, a slow blooming sensation that made him feel drowsy and oddly content, as though he belonged to the cemetery more than the world outside. He never saw anyone else sit there for long. Other workers might perch for a minute or two, but soon moved on, rubbing their arms and shaking off a chill only they seemed to feel. It was only after several weeks that he realized the bench was never empty in the morning. There were always marks in the frost, impressions in the snow, as if someone or something had already claimed the spot before dawn. And in the hush that followed, he sometimes thought he could hear faint voices carried by the wind, not speaking but whispering, the way old trees creak when nobody's around. That winter, the bench became a kind of anchor for him, a place to start and end each round, his boots making the same path in the snow. The world always a little warmer, and a little quieter whenever he paused to rest there, even as the cemetery around him remained frozen in the grip of another endless January. After weeks of noticing the bench's unseasonable warmth, the gravedigger found himself one bitter dawn drawn to it more than usual. The wind was a knife slicing through his jacket, and he let himself sink onto the wooden slats, exhaling clouds into the still air. He hadn't slept well too many late nights, the cold creeping into his bones and thoughts of paperwork piling up on his desk. For the first time, instead of sipping his coffee and moving on, he let his eyelids drop, surrendering to the comfort the bench offered. The world shrank to the slow rhythm of his breathing and the subtle radiance beneath him, and he slipped into a sleep that felt nothing like rest. He dreamed in vivid detail a funeral procession, winding along the gravel. Pallbearers he didn't recognize lowering a casket draped in blue into a plot beside the old willow. He saw faces of mourners, their eyes glistening with grief, the exact arrangement of lily atop the lid, and even the cadence of the preacher's voice as he spoke a name that rang no bell in the gravedigger's mind. When he woke, the coffee in his thermos was cold, and the frost had vanished from the ground around his feet. But the dream clung to him, sharp and undeniable. He could recall every detail, the shape of the brass handles, the color of the sky, the way the crows circled overhead before the first shovel of earth was tossed onto the casket. It unsettled him more than he liked to admit. The next day, he checked the schedule. No such funeral planned, no names matching the ones he remembered, no reserved plots. It was only a dream, he told himself. But as the week wore on, snippets of the dream began to surface in the real world. A delivery arrived with an arrangement of lily, precisely like the ones he'd seen in his sleep. The preacher's car, which he hadn't noticed in months, showed up parked by the chapel. And then, days later, a death notice came in for a man with the same name he'd heard in the dream, the same age, same family, everything matching exactly what he'd seen while dozing on that unseasonably warm bench. The Coviro shook off the chill that crept into his blood, trying to convince himself it was coincidence, or his mind playing tricks after too many years among the graves. But that night, as he closed up, he caught sight of the bench through the frosted office window, a thin wisp of steam rising from the wood in the moonlight, and realized he didn't really believe in coincidence anymore. From that day forward, the bench haunted his thoughts more than the graves themselves. He started to watch for who sat there, what stories they told afterward, and how often the bench remained empty on the coldest mornings. Stories circulated among the staff whispers over coffee, exchanged glances in the break room about strange dreams that seemed to bloom only after a nap on that particular seat. The gravedigger collected these stories in silence, never admitting to his own vision, but listening for echoes of what he'd seen. A young groundskeeper confessed, with eyes wide and voice low, to dreaming of a funeral where the casket was so small it could fit in her arms. And 2 days later, news came of a tragic accident involving a child from the neighboring village. An older attendant described a service for a woman dressed in a red scarf, weeping relatives clutching carnations, and the week after, a widow arrived, asking for a plot with room for her late sister and herself. Names, faces, and details repeated themselves in a cycle impossible to ignore. The Coviro began to keep a notebook in his locker, jotting down dates, names, and fragments of his colleagues' recollections, matching them against the records as each new death crept closer to what the dreams had foretold. He soon realized the bench didn't just predict the future. It forced whoever sat on it to bear witness before the rest of the world caught up. And it was never wrong, not once. Mourners would appear just as described, flowers matching the color and shape from someone's restless sleep, the pattern of rain on the chapel roof, or the precise words spoken at the graveside, echoing what had played out in the dreams. The knowledge was a burden, heavy and cold, despite the bench's warmth, and the Coviro sometimes wondered if that heat was the only comfort the dead allowed the living for carrying such a weight. He stopped sitting on the bench unless exhausted past resistance, afraid of what he might see next. But every week, there was someone new willing to try, drawn by the uncanny warmth or a dare passed down through the staff. A chain of dreams and deaths continued unbroken. The bench at the cemetery gate, holding secrets no one truly wanted to know, except, perhaps, those who had no choice but to listen, and remember, and wait for the cold to return. He resisted the urge to rest there for weeks, determined not to see another vision, not to know another death before its time. But on a particularly bleak morning, after a night of rain and broken sleep, he surrendered. The chill of the cemetery seemed to press into his bones, and the warmth of the bench called to him, insistent and almost merciful. He sat, meant only to catch his breath, but the comfort seeped up through the wood and lulled him quickly into a heavy, inescapable sleep. In that dream, the world was wrapped in fog. He stood at the edge of the cemetery and watched mourners gather faces from every corner of his life, some aged, some as he remembered them from childhood. He saw the funeral procession, the heavy casket draped in deep blue, lily on top, the same lily his mother had favored. The priest recited prayers he'd heard 1,000 times, but now seemed meant for him alone. His name was spoken, softly at first, then rising in a chorus, each voice familiar, each one belonging to someone he'd buried, cared for, or simply comforted in passing. He felt the cold of the earth as the grave was filled, the sharp bite of the morning frost pressing into his hands, his cheeks, his chest. He could not move, could not call out, just watched as his own story was recited with a gentle finality he'd never known before. When he woke, the warmth of the bench was gone. His hands trembled with cold, and the breath from his lungs seemed to turn to mist before his eyes. The sun had risen, but the gatekeeper and groundskeeper, both old friends, stood nearby, silent, watching him with a strange blend of pity and resignation. He realized, by the way they averted their eyes, by the heavy quiet that hung between them, that his dream was not a warning, but a rehearsal. They too had known, somehow, and nothing could be said that would change the script written in that restless sleep. The details lingered all day, the flowers, the prayers, the sequence of steps through the cemetery. Each one, he knew, would soon unfold exactly as he had seen, and there was no warmth left for him on that bench, nor anywhere else in the world, as he waited for the procession he had already lived once before. The following days passed in a numb, slow haze, the cemetery feeling colder than it ever had, as if the very ground had withdrawn any remaining comfort from him. Each morning he walked his rounds with the habitual care of a man who knew every stone, every dip in the land, but found himself pausing before the old wooden bench by the gate. Now, each time he reached out, the surface was icy, refusing to yield any warmth, no matter how long he pressed his palm against the grain. The other groundskeepers cast furtive glances in his direction, whispering to each other, but always falling silent when he drew near. The bench remained empty for days, as if the entire cemetery understood that its work with him was complete. He realized then that the bench was not merely an old seat for the weary, but a threshold one that invited the burden of foresight only when someone was needed to carry it. Its heat, he saw now, was not the gentle comfort of wood, but the pulsing echo of fate itself, a residue left by all the lives it had touched, all the deaths it had foreseen. On the 7th morning after his final dream, a young assistant, new to the staff and oblivious to the unspoken rules, slumped onto the bench after a heavy morning shift. He watched from a distance as the young man leaned back, closed his eyes, and fell into a quick, uneasy doze. When he woke, the assistant blinked in confusion, then stared at the old Covero, his face pale, lips pressed tight, as if grappling with a secret too heavy to share. Later, he would hear the others mutter. The bench was warm again, and the dreams had returned. The cycle, he understood, would go on. He was not the first to carry the knowledge of funerals yet to come, and he would not be the last. In the small hours, when the world was quiet, he found himself grateful for the cold that now belonged to him, alone grateful, in a way that the heat had moved on. He left the gate open a little wider those mornings, allowing the breeze to pass over the bench, hoping that, for whoever came next, the burden would not be too heavy, and the dreams not too dark. Story 4. The rain had started before dawn and didn't let up for hours, drumming relentlessly against every slate and headstone, turning the cemetery paths to rivers of dark mud and the grass into a tangle of slick threads underfoot. I'd buried plenty of people in the rain before, but that morning felt different. The wind sharper, the clouds lower, pressing down on the crowd until even their umbrellas seemed to sag. By the time the hearse rolled away and the last mourners vanished into their cars, only the echo of the priest's voice lingered, mixing with the rumble of thunder. That was when I saw it, a black umbrella, old and wide-brimmed, propped against the iron gate just beyond the last row of graves. It looked like something out of a film-heavy canvas, wooden handle, faintly frayed edges where the fabric met the ribs. I almost didn't notice it at first. Plenty of people forget things at funerals, but umbrellas rarely survive the sorting of family members rushing home to warmth. I scooped it up, expecting it to be slick with rain, but it was heavier than it should have been, and cold to the touch, colder than the wind on my soaked jacket, colder than the marble stones under my hand. I shook it out, expecting a spray, but the water just kept falling from it, trickling in thin, silvery lines onto the gravel path below. Even when I stashed it in the equipment room that evening, it kept dripping steadily, pooling in a dark, irregular circle on the tile floor long after the rest of my clothes had dried. I left it leaning against the mop bucket, planning to ask the office if anyone had called about a lost item, but by the time I finished my rounds, the only sound in the hallway was the soft, steady patter of water like a tiny rainstorm that wouldn't end. The umbrella looked so ordinary, yet every time I glanced at it, I was struck by the feeling that it didn't belong to anyone still living, that it was waiting, patient, for someone to notice it wasn't meant to be found. I tried to ignore the umbrella for days, leaving it wedged behind the door, but each morning I'd find a fresh puddle beneath its dripping canopy. The janitor grumbled about leaks in the roof, but I knew it was always the same spot, the water as cold as ice melt, seeping into the grout, no matter how dry the forecast. The first time I used it was a Wednesday, when a funeral for a young man caught everyone by surprise, the sky breaking open minutes after the coffin arrived. My own umbrella had finally split along the ribs, so I reached for the forgotten black one, opening it with a snap that sent a spray of cold droplets into my face. It was heavier than any umbrella I'd carried, the handle thick and smooth as bone, the canvas so dense it muffled the sound of the rain above me. But the cold was the worst of it. Each drop that rolled down the inside brushed my face and hands with a chill that bit through my skin, leaving a tingling ache long after it fell to the earth. At first I thought the wind had shifted the spray, but no matter how I tilted the umbrella, the droplets fell straight down from within, indifferent to the storm raging above. They clung to the inside seams, forming beads that never seemed to merge or drop off naturally, each one sliding down at its own pace, slow and deliberate, as if it was waiting for me to look up and notice. The rain outside was relentless, but inside that umbrella, the water felt ancient and foreign, laced with something colder than weather. By the time I reached the gravesite, my shirt beneath my jacket was soaked with chill. The family stared at me, perhaps wondering why my face looked so pale, or why I seemed to shiver despite my coat. As the coffin was lowered and the priest droned the final words, a drop slid down the back of my neck, sharp as ice, and for a split second I saw no. I felt something behind my eyes. It wasn't a memory, not mine. It was a flash of someone running through a forest, feet stumbling over roots, a breathless fear that had nothing to do with the weather. The sensation passed as quickly as it came, leaving only the cold and the confusion, and a lingering, indefinable sadness. I snapped the umbrella shut when it was over, hoping the water would stop, but as I carried it back to the office, it kept dripping steadily, leaving a faint trail behind me through the corridor. Each drop that fell seemed to take a piece of warmth from my body, a piece I couldn't get back. My hands ached as if I'd spent hours in snow, and when I looked down, the skin was pale and wrinkled, as though the cold had aged me by years and minutes. That night, I tried to dry the umbrella completely, opening it in the staff room and setting it near the heater, but the heat made no difference. The drops continued to gather and fall, an endless procession of tiny, deliberate reminders that something about this object defied the logic of weather, of time, of life itself. No one else in the funeral home seemed to care, or even notice that I was carrying around a storm that only I could feel. And yet, every time I tried to forget about it, I found myself drawn back to the umbrella testing the fabric, watching the water slide along the ribs, feeling the creeping chill that worked its way into my bones. I started to dread the sound of rain, because I knew that was when the umbrella called to me most. I began to wonder if every drop that fell was just water, or if it carried something else, some memory, some fragment of sorrow left behind by the last person it had sheltered. Each night, as the rain drummed against the windows, and I heard the echo of those dripping sounds in the next room, I lay awake, convinced that the storm inside the umbrella was waiting for me to remember a grief that wasn't mine. It started as a vague discomfort, a shadow of memory brushing just beneath the surface whenever a drop touched my skin. But soon the sensations grew sharper, impossible to dismiss as mere nerves or fatigue. The second time I used the umbrella, another storm had rolled in quick and bitter, the kind that soaks the city before you even know the clouds are gathering. I grabbed the old black umbrella by instinct, cursing under my breath as its weight pulled my arm downward. This time, as soon as the first icy drop slid down the handle and splattered against the back of my hand, I felt it, a stinging flash of loss, so deep it buckled my knees. Suddenly, I was somewhere else, in a room I didn't recognize, and yet I knew it in my bones. A woman's voice called for someone, a child, maybe a name I almost remembered, and I felt a burst of joy and the quick, cutting absence that only comes after death. When I shook my head to clear the vision, my hand was trembling, and the cold seemed to have seeped into my veins, threading up my arm and into my chest. From then on, I paid closer attention to each drop. Sometimes it was a jolt of anger, other times a brief, brilliant flicker of happiness, always fleeting, always tinged with the finality of something lost. One morning, as I wiped a chill bead from my cheek, I found myself humming an old hymn I hadn't heard since my own father's funeral decades ago, the melody and words arriving whole, untouched by time. I asked my coworkers if they'd heard the song, if maybe it had played over the speakers during the last service, but they all shook their heads. None of them remembered any music that day, or even the particular funeral I described. The days blurred together as rain returned again and again, and with each storm, the umbrella seemed to collect more than just water. I began to recognize the faces that flickered behind my eyes when the drops fell. A young boy with a crooked smile, an old woman clutching a rosary, a man laughing under a tree, his laughter abruptly cut short. Sometimes the memories overlapped, different lives running together, details blending until I couldn't tell if I was remembering my own family or someone else's grief. It was as if the umbrella had become a vessel, catching not only rain, but the echoes of every funeral it had attended, every final goodbye it had witnessed under gray skies. I grew wary of using the umbrella, but the weather gave me little choice. The more I tried to avoid it, the more insistent the storms became, and the more I found the umbrella waiting for me, perfectly placed by the door, always dripping, always cold. At night, even when I left it locked in a closet, I dreamed of walking through rows of wet graves, each droplet that landed on my skin awakening a new surge of feeling, a rush of love or fear, or the dull, aching void of loss. I started to wonder if I was losing myself inside these fragments, if the line between my own memories and the ones hidden inside those relentless drops was fading away. And always, in the quiet after the storm, I found myself longing for the warmth of my own life, terrified that each new memory carried by the rain might replace another piece of me, until all that was left were the stories of the dead, falling endlessly from a sky that would never dry. I soon discovered that no matter what I tried, the umbrella could not be separated from me for long. After the fourth storm, I left it behind on purpose, propped open in the back corner of the supply closet at work, determined to break the cycle. When I returned the next morning, it was gone from where I'd left it, only to reappear, inexplicably, beside my own locker. Still wet, still shedding droplets that pooled on the tile and left a cold, glistening stain. The janitor swore he hadn't seen it. I even accused one of the groundskeepers of playing a prank, but he only looked at me with tired eyes and muttered that he never touched objects left by the dead. Thinking it might finally be rid of me, I tossed the umbrella in a dumpster behind the funeral home on a clear, cloudless day. That night, I woke to the sound of rain inside my house, in the hallway. The next morning, the umbrella leaned against my front door, water trickling from its ribs, leaving a faint trail across the mat. My wife never saw it arrive. I tried giving it away to a young apprentice who laughed at the story, calling it a Covira superstition. He brought it home and called out sick the following day, trembling and pale, refusing to speak of the dreams that kept him from sleeping. The umbrella was back in my car before nightfall, as wet as ever. Others who tried to use the umbrella reported odd things. Nightmares in which they wandered endless graveyards, conversations with strangers who had been dead for decades, sudden chills that didn't fade even after stepping into sunlight. Some simply claimed the umbrella wouldn't open for them, or else snapped shut in their hands, pinching their fingers until they bled. Each attempt to break the connection only seemed to reinforce it, as if the object had made its choice, and its choice was me. The memories in the drops became more personal, their details sharper. Now, I saw not only the lives of the newly buried, but glimpses of my own past, interwoven with theirs, my mother's voice at bedtime, the first snowfall I ever witnessed, the sting of grief at my brother's funeral. The umbrella was no longer just a vessel for the dead. It had become a mirror for everything I'd tried to forget or bury. My hands grew colder every time I held it. My sleep grew shorter, and I wondered with mounting dread how many memories it could hold before it began pouring them back out, drop by drop, until all that remained were the ghosts of everyone I had ever known living and dead, waiting for the rain to call them home. It happened on a morning weighed down by a restless sky and an exhaustion that clung to me like wet fabric. I found the umbrella already open on the chair behind my desk in the Coviro's office, its ribs arched wide and the fabric glossy, reflecting the sallow overhead light. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another odd return, another night haunted by fragmented memories. But then I noticed the puddle collecting beneath. It wasn't clear. The droplets that struck the tile had a viscous, dark red sheen, spreading slowly in a way that made my skin prickle. I knelt to wipe it up, and the rag came away stained as though I'd pressed it to an old wound. The air chilled. As I touched the umbrella, a shock rippled up my arm, and in that instant, every droplet that rolled from the fabric carried not just a stranger's sorrow, but pieces of my own history that I'd buried deeper than any grave I'd ever dug. I saw my father's face the day he died, how I'd refused to weep, hiding in the rain behind a mausoleum, pressing my hands to my ears so I wouldn't hear the lament. The memory surged with the cold bite of regret, and as more drops slid from the umbrella's edge, more memories followed. My childhood mistakes, harsh words spoken in anger, the names of friends I'd lost track of, their funerals held under skies just like this. The blood like water dripped in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I realized then that the umbrella had ceased to merely absorb the lives and secrets of the dead. It was dredging up every regret, every hidden sin, every moment I wished forgotten. The faces in my mind's eye became a procession, not just the departed whose ashes I'd scattered, but those I'd wronged or neglected, alive in bed, their accusations silent but heavy. Every drop that struck my skin left a shiver, and I knew with a clarity that chilled me to the marrow that this storm would never end so long as the umbrella remained in my possession. I tried, one last time, to leave it at a grave, the grave of the first child I ever helped to bury, whose mother still brought flowers every year. I opened the umbrella, propped it against the marble, and whispered an apology into the wind. The rain let up for a moment, but as I walked away, a single cold drop landed on the nape of my neck. I turned, and there was the umbrella in my hand, impossibly, inevitably. Its weight was familiar. Its chill was absolute. I understood. As long as there were funerals, as long as there were memories too painful for the living to bear, someone would be chosen to carry the storm. The umbrella, always wet, always cold, would pass from hand to hand, life to life, drop by drop each memory, each sorrow, each drop of imagined blood marking the path of those left behind, too burdened to forget and too weary to let go. Story 5. It started as just another sweep of the lost and found shelf. The Coviro's half-hearted routine at the start of every month. Check for wallets, misplaced keys, the odd umbrella forgotten after a stormy funeral. He never expected anything important. Yet that morning, beneath a stack of rain-sodden condolence cards and a cracked flashlight, his hand closed on something heavy, gritty to the touch, unmistakably old. He turned it over in his palm, a key, thick and rough-edged, corroded with rust, and inexplicably cold despite the muggy air. The metal was unlike anything used for modern locks in the cemetery. The bow shaped into a circle, etched with faint, indecipherable symbols, the shaft twisted and barbed. There was no tag attached, no string, no number stamped into the handle. It was the kind of thing that should have been lost to time, a relic misplaced by accident or perhaps by design, and it seemed to radiate a gentle pull, a suggestion at the edge of consciousness that he should keep it with him. He took it to the break room first, holding it out to coworkers who shrugged or shook their heads. Nobody recognized the key or remembered seeing it on any of the doors or cabinets they used every day. Maybe it's from one of the old storage sheds, someone guessed. But the oldest employee, a man who'd started in the 70s, just frowned. "That's not from anything I know," he said, sounding almost uneasy. "Maybe it's from one of the mausoleums nobody opens anymore." But even among the maze of crypts and family vaults, he had never seen a lock that needed such a key. That afternoon, unable to shake the strange compulsion, the Coviro wandered the grounds with the key in his pocket, feeling its weight tug him toward the oldest section of the cemetery. The further he walked, the colder it seemed to become, a sharpness in the air that made his teeth ache. Shadows seemed deeper among the overgrown stones, and the birds were silent overhead. He found himself pausing beside a mausoleum whose name was all but erased by time, a structure he'd passed 100 times, but never given a second glance. The iron gate was sealed with a lock, so eaten with rust it seemed fused shut, but the key, in his hand now, without remembering reaching for it, fit the lock perfectly, sliding home with a satisfying click. Inside, the air smelled of earth and old secrets. The interior was choked with dust, but his eyes were drawn to a second door, this one of stone, half buried in the far wall. It had no handle, only a carved keyhole. The key, still slick and cold, fit again. As he turned it, a faint vibration traveled up his arm. The stone door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage curling downward, lined with niches and strange, antique artifacts he couldn't identify. Somewhere behind him, the outer mausoleum door closed with a gentle but final click. For the first time in years, the Coviro felt not only lost but chosen, a visitor guided by an object that shouldn't exist, through thresholds no living soul was ever meant to cross. He should have left then, locked the gates behind him, handed the key to the city records office, and told them to store it in some vault for oddities. But there was something in the air of that mausoleum an ache, or perhaps the memory of hundreds of aches layered over each other through the decades. The passage behind the stone door was impossibly narrow at first, but as he moved forward, holding his phone up for light, the walls seemed to recede. The key in his hand grew inexplicably warm, as if anticipating every step, and he found his fingers tracing the odd engravings along the corridor dates that didn't match any burials. names that flickered in the phone's glow as if still in the act of being written. The hallway ended in another door, this one wooden, with deep gashes clawed into the grain. There was no lock, only a circular hollow that matched the bow of the key perfectly. He pressed the key to it and felt it catch, not in metal, but in the wood itself, as if the tree that birthed this door had grown to match the key's shape. When he twisted, the wood groaned and swung inward, and a rush of cold, stale air swept over him, as if he'd disturbed the sleep of centuries. Beyond was a small chamber, walls lined with boxes and ledgers, shelves stacked with personal effects, old spectacles, medals, letters bundled with string, photographs so faded the faces were little more than ghostly smudges. In the center of the room, a solitary marble slab, empty but for a name carved so deeply it looked freshly cut, though the name itself was blurred, as if the stone had wept and dissolved half the inscription away. He knelt, tracing the edge of the slab, feeling the vibrations run through the stone and into his hand, and when he glanced back at the shelves, he realized with a slow dread that some of the objects, an embroidered handkerchief, a tarnished silver lighter, were things he had seen before in his years working the grounds, lost and unclaimed after funerals no one attended. Something in the dust shifted, the low whine of wind through cracks above his head. He stood, retracing his steps to the door, but it didn't open at his touch. The key, when he pressed it to the hollow, turned with reluctance, as if it had to be convinced to let him leave. When he finally emerged into the mausoleum and out to the fading afternoon, he felt the world had changed angles slightly warped, shadows leaning where they shouldn't, the breeze thick with whispers. He checked his phone. 2 hours had passed, though he would have sworn on his own name it was only minutes. The key was colder than ever, humming softly in his palm, and as he stepped outside, he glanced over his shoulder at the mausoleum and saw, for the briefest instant, the wooden door he'd found closed again, but with his own initials etched into the frame, as if someone had always known he would be the one to find it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The key felt heavier on his bedside table than any object that small should. When he closed his eyes, he saw corridors shifting behind the walls of the cemetery-hidden rooms, rearranging themselves with every breath he took. By morning, he convinced himself it was exhaustion, just a residue of anxiety from the strange passage. But when he arrived for his shift, the world seemed intent on disproving him. The chapel's storage closet, once stubbornly jammed, now opened easily at the first turn of the key, but revealed not the mop and bucket he expected, but a cramped chamber lined with ledgers written in a language he couldn't read, the air heavy with the scent of old wax and wilted flowers. He tried the key in other places. An old file cabinet, supposedly broken for years, now slid open to display a series of hand-bound journals, none bearing his name, but each marked with the same peculiar sigil etched onto the key's bow. Even doors he'd known for years, ones that should have led to the main hallway or the grounds outside, sometimes opened onto unfamiliar stretches of corridor where light fell in angles that made no sense, and where the echoes of his own footsteps seemed to precede him. Each new room was stranger than the last. One day, he opened the door to the chapel office and found himself facing rows of memorial candles, all burning, though the building was empty and unheated. Another time, he stepped through a side entrance to the tool shed and emerged into a long, arched corridor he'd never seen before. The walls hung with ancient funeral portraits, whose subjects sometimes seemed to move, turning their eyes to follow him as he passed. The key didn't just open rooms, it seemed to create them, or call them up from some deep layered memory of the cemetery. He'd meet colleagues in the hall, ask them about the doors, but they'd only shrug and look confused when he described what he'd seen. Sometimes he'd double back, try to revisit a room he'd just left, only to find the door locked or opening onto nothing more than dusty shelves and ordinary tools. Each time, he felt a little more detached from the layout he'd once known so well, as if the cemetery were slowly rearranging itself around the presence of the key in his pocket. There were moments when he considered leaving the key behind, locking it in the lost and found, pretending he'd never seen it. But then he'd remember the sound of the stone door opening, the cold whisper of air from that impossible passage, the objects on the shelves that shouldn't have existed. The cemetery, once a place of routine and protocol, was now a living puzzle, and the key pulsed with a promise, or perhaps a warning, that he was only at the beginning of what it wanted to reveal. He soon realized the key's power wasn't confined to dusty rooms or forgotten corridors. It began to infect the very heart of his daily work. On a bright Monday, he found a fresh grave marked with a new brass lock, though he knew it hadn't been ordered, and none of the others on staff admitted to placing it. The lock was old antique, patterned with the same ornate script he'd glimpsed in those hand-bound journals. It clicked open with the key, so smoothly that for a moment he forgot to be afraid. Inside, the coffin lay as expected, but propped atop the wood was a small envelope addressed to no one, sealed with red wax. When he broke it, he found a letter written in the looping hand of someone long dead, a confession and a plea for forgiveness, signed by a name that matched the faded stone at his feet. In other graves, the key opened boxes tucked under rotting earth, a pocket watch still ticking, a wedding ring, bundles of brittle letters, all clearly precious to someone, but to whom he could never say. More unsettling still, sometimes the key revealed doors hidden in the earth itself, little iron-handled hatches that led to cramped, torch-lit chambers where the walls were covered in names he recognized from funeral registers, names of people he'd buried, names of families that had vanished from the town. Each time the key found a new lock, the cemetery seemed to shift a little more. Fresh graves appeared overnight, in rows he could have sworn were empty. The ground in the oldest section softened, as if waiting for him to return and unlock some further secret. Colleagues became distant, their faces growing wary when he spoke about what he found. They started giving him the easier routes, the simpler burials, as if hoping the strangeness would leave him if he stopped looking for it. But the key called to him with a gravity he couldn't deny. The sense of being watched grew stronger. Sometimes, while turning the key, he heard faint voices, some pleading, some angry, some so familiar he thought he heard his own name. On one occasion, after opening a grave that shouldn't have existed, he found a small mirror inside, its glass clouded and blackened, except for a spot at the center where he saw his own eyes, wide with fear. The next morning, that grave was gone. Only the impression of a key remained in the soft soil. He came to understand that the key was more than a tool. It was an invitation and a test. The cemetery had secrets it wanted to show him, and every lock he turned, every door or grave he opened, added to the invisible ledger of what he knew and what he might never be able to forget or explain. In the days that followed, the key seemed to grow heavier with each secret it unlocked. The rust began to spread up his fingers every time he handled it, staining the creases of his palm, a deep, corroded red that wouldn't scrub away. Colleagues whispered now when he passed, giving him wide berth, eyes flicking down to the chain at his belt, where the key always hung. He felt the boundary between himself and the cemetery blurring. Every evening the wind sounded more like a summons. Every night, the lock mechanisms he'd never noticed before gleamed in the dusk, inviting his touch. Then, one rain-slicked evening when the mist hung thick and cold across the headstones, he saw at a door at the far end of the grounds, where only tangled weeds and leaning crosses had been before. It was tall, made of ancient, water-warped wood bound in tarnished iron, no hinges visible, only a keyhole dark as a well at its heart. It shouldn't have existed. The cemetery map showed nothing but empty ground, yet the key in his hand vibrated with a low, eager pulse, as if the lock had been waiting for his arrival. He hesitated, but the pull was too strong. He slid the key into the lock. It turned this time with a deep, final click that echoed through the marble and earth around him. The door creaked inward, revealing not a crypt or storage room, but a narrow corridor lined with all the doors and tombs he'd ever opened, stone and wood, iron and glass, stretching impossibly far into darkness. each one marked by a memory, a secret, a name he had read by lamplight or chiseled into granite. He walked, heart thudding, past scenes from every burial he tended. Some doors were ajar, revealing flashes of other funerals, brief snatches of mourning, laughter, regret. Some stood shut, emanating cold so deep it hurt his teeth. At the corridor's end stood one last door smaller, made of polished black wood. Its keyhole was perfectly fitted for the ancient key, and carved above was his own name. The date left blank. He understood then. Every Coviro before him had been called to this passage. The key was a test, a burden passed from hand to hand, drawing its bearer ever deeper into the hidden architecture of the cemetery's memory. He inserted the key and turned. The door swung open to a moonlit clearing where all the other Coviros, living and dead, waited in a silent semicircle, keys in hand, watching him join their number. The iron grew cold and light in his palm, then faded to dust, leaving only the echo of its weight, a memory that would now wait for the next soul willing to unlock what should stay closed. Story 6. The night had settled thick and heavy over the city by the time I finished my last run. I'd been driving this hearse for more years than I'd admit aloud, and by now, every route, every turn, every protocol was second nature. It was only on nights like that one, quiet and cold enough to make your bones ache, that anything managed to unsettle me. I remember parking the van behind the funeral home, the air outside so chilled that my breath hung in front of my face in slow, lingering clouds. I gathered up the paperwork, checked the locks, and as I was about to leave, I caught something odd in the corner of my eye. The back window, already fogged by the difference between inside and out, held a message traced by a single finger. Help me. Just those two words. The strokes hesitant and thin, as if whoever wrote it was unsure they'd be seen at all. I stared at it for a long moment, certain it was a trick of condensation or some childish prank. Maybe one of the kids from the block, or a coworker, trying to break up the monotony of the night shift. I wiped the words away with my sleeve, leaving only a smear and the faint scent of old wax from the polish we used to keep the van clean. The next night, though, it was there again. Same spot, different message. Cold here. I felt the skin on my neck tighten as I reached for the handle. Inside, it was no colder than usual, but the words left a chill in my chest. I cleaned the window more thoroughly, trying not to think too much about it, but when I returned from my next run, another phrase waited for me, each letter uneven. Not alone. It was around that point I stopped telling myself it was a prank. No one else had keys to the van. No one else logged in for the night shift that week but me. I started checking the glass before every drive, sometimes even mid-route, watching for the next communication. The messages grew longer. Remember me. Still waiting. Who will help? But always faded after a few hours, as if the heat from the day or the sun's first rays erased whatever was left. I never saw anyone near the van, no one lingering in the lot or sneaking a finger over the foggy surface. The security cameras faced the wrong way, and my coworkers dismissed it as sleep deprivation or an overactive imagination. But every night, like clockwork, the words returned, and the air in the cab felt just a little heavier, as if something had slipped in quietly to ride with me and refused to leave until I acknowledged its presence. It wasn't long before I started to keep a notebook, jotting down the messages as they appeared, hoping to find some pattern, some explanation. It was only then I realized the dates they appeared matched certain deliveries, cases where paperwork had gone missing, families hadn't claimed the bodies, or names had been scrubbed from the system. The kind of lonely deaths that always left a taste of unfinished business behind. It made me think, as I drove alone each night, about all the ways we fail to remember, and how easy it is to leave someone behind in the fog. I started to anticipate the messages before they came, my mind drifting to the rear window of the van every time I pulled to a stop, as if half expecting to find another set of words waiting for me. It became a nightly ritual park, gather my things, glance back, feel the odd flutter of dread and curiosity coil up in my chest. Some nights, the message would be a simple plea, a let me out or so cold in here, as if the glass was the only barrier between whatever was trapped and the rest of the world. Other times, it was a name I didn't recognize, a date I'd have to search for in the old funeral logs, or a phrase that felt like a memory from a life I'd never lived. Don't forget the lost, or you promised. I'd stare at the words, sometimes repeating them under my breath, the syllables growing heavier each time. At first, I tried to talk about it. I told one of the older attendants, someone who'd been in the business long enough to have seen a few strange things himself. He laughed, told me stories about how grief plays tricks on the living, how sometimes when you're close to the border between worlds, you pick up the residue, like static on an old radio. Still, I could tell he was uneasy. He started checking the van himself, running a finger over the window after every shift, never saying whether he saw what I saw. The rest of the crew shrugged it off as a joke, a bit of late-night stress, but I stopped trying to explain. As the nights dragged on, the messages shifted from vague cries for help to something more pointed, more personal. It was as if the voice behind the condensation had learned who I was, or perhaps always knew. You remember me, one read, the loops of each letter pressed hard into the fog. On another night, you said you would help. These hit different. I found myself racking my memory for a promise left unfulfilled, a favor never repaid, a name I'd forgotten. When I cross-referenced some of the names and dates from the messages, I realized several matched those I'd handled in the last year, bodies left unclaimed, those lonely transfers in the ring, the ones I never thought much about at the time. Sometimes a message would be a question, why did you leave? And it would echo in my mind, long after the words had vanished from the glass. It got so that I would drive with the heat low, my breath fogging the glass, just to see if any letters would form in the mist. I couldn't shake the sense that there was something unfinished about my work, that each message was a small reminder that these weren't just bodies, but stories that hadn't been properly ended. Sometimes I dreamed of the van's rear window, the words crawling across the glass in shaky lines, dozens at once, all pleading to be heard, all desperate not to be forgotten. I woke with the taste of their names on my tongue, the echo of the messages burning in my mind. By then, I knew the requests wouldn't stop, not until I figured out what they wanted, and who, exactly, was speaking to me through the fog. The next shift began with an unshakable weight in my stomach, a sense of waiting for something I already dreaded. I unlocked the van and immediately checked the window, half relieved and half disappointed to see it clear, as if the night itself was holding its breath. But as the engine warmed and condensation crept up from the corners, letters began to appear, slow and deliberate, as if someone invisible pressed a finger from the other side. Don't deliver the next one. The phrase chilled me more than the air outside. Unlike the pleas and half-memories of nights before, this was a direct warning, an instruction, as if the source of all these messages finally had a purpose for me. I repeated it in my head. Don't deliver the next one, feeling its urgency grow as the hours inched forward. Back in the office, I saw my name on the transport roster for the midnight run. A new body, an unfamiliar name, paperwork stamped and official. But the surname jolted me Garrett, my own last name. I'd never heard of this person, never met them in any family story, but there it was in black ink, assigned to me. The air in the room turned heavy. When I asked the dispatcher for details, she shrugged. No family, no requests. Just another late transfer. Don't overthink it. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, especially after all those nights with the van's haunted window, all those forgotten names pleading for closure. On my break, I went through the record's obituaries, death notices, even old funeral home files. No mention of any Garrett dying recently, at least none I could place. Yet the details on the paperwork were precise. Earth year, location, next of kin left blank. I read the name over and over, my own family name echoing back at me, and with it, all the warnings that had appeared on the window. That afternoon, as I prepped the van, I wiped the window again, almost out of habit. Nothing. But when I stepped outside and let my breath fog the glass, a single new word appeared, scrawled backwards so I could only read it from inside. Family. The loops were unmistakable, the same hurried finger, the same desperate message. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was all a coincidence, a stress-induced trick of the mind, a pattern I'd only noticed because I was looking for it. But deep down, I knew the messages had always meant something, that the pleas and the warnings were building to this. That night, as I buckled in for the drive, I felt as though the weight of every forgotten name, every plea I'd failed to answer, every unfinished promise now rested with this body and this journey. The van was colder than usual, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. The words replayed in my mind, sharper with every mile. Don't deliver the next one. I didn't know what would happen if I disobeyed, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I could just follow the route and do my job as if none of it mattered. I was in the middle of something older, stranger, and far more personal than I'd ever imagined. And the van, with its haunted glass, was no longer just a vehicle for the dead. It was now a messenger for the living as well. The night pressed heavy as I began the drive, each streetlight stretching long and thin across the windshield, my own reflection blurring with every breath. In the rear view, the van's interior loomed larger than it should, a box of shadow and secrets, a silent passenger for every unspoken plea. I checked the rear compartment more than once, half expecting to see movement, half dreading it. The body was there, sealed and anonymous, but the name tag with my surname pulled at something deep in my memory, as if some root I'd forgotten was finally being tugged loose. The window had remained clear since the last warning, but I felt watched from all sides, the sense of company never fading. As the miles passed, the air in the cab cooled, thickened, made breathing slow and difficult. The dashboard clock blinked and reset. The radio sputtered static, and for a brief second, I thought I heard a voice in the hiss my own name, whispered as if from far away, layered beneath the static. I pressed the button to turn it off, but the static persisted until I pulled the fuse. That's when the condensation returned, blooming across the glass in delicate frostwork. Words etched themselves out of nothing. Turn back, not safe, he knows you. They vanished when I blinked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that every warning was for me, and me alone. With each turn, the GPS recalculated, sending me down side streets and alleyways I didn't remember from any previous run. My hands grew numb on the wheel. The temperature in the cab dropped further, and a light fog crept from the vents, pooling near my feet. Glancing in the mirror, I caught flashes of motion brief, flickering shapes, pale as candle smoke, clustered in the shadows behind the driver's seat. They never fully resolved, but each time I looked away, the chill intensified, as if they'd moved closer. When I reached the destination, a funeral home on the edge of town, known but unfamiliar, the lot was empty, the lights off. The building stood dark and silent, windows black. No living attendant met me, only the van and its cargo, the haunted window, and the name tag with my own blood. As I opened the back doors, I found myself hesitating, an invisible barrier holding me in place. The glass was fully fogged now, every inch covered in desperate messages. Don't do it. He's waiting. You promised. I reached for the gurney, but my hands wouldn't close around the handles. For a long moment, I stood frozen, heart pounding. Somewhere inside, a door banged. The wind picked up, rattling the van, and a sharp scent of flowers funeral lily, wilted and old, filled the air. I backed away, leaving the body where it was, doors open to the night. My mind raced. To deliver or not to deliver? The warnings felt too urgent, too pointed, to ignore. I made my choice. I shut the doors, started the engine, and drove away, ignoring the GPS, the route, the rules. In the mirror, the condensation cleared in a single streak, revealing one last message. Thank you. I didn't know if I'd broken a curse or simply begun another. But as I pulled away from the funeral home, the air lightened, the static faded, and I felt, if only for a moment, that I was finally driving away from something, not toward it. The van, usually a cold accomplice to so many secrets, seemed for once to let me go free. I returned to the depot at the edge of dawn, headlights carving the low mist, the van trailing the scent of cold lily and old earth. My hands were still shaking, a residue of fear and resolve mingling as I parked and sat with the engine idling, staring at the glass. Silence blanketed the yard, broken only by the hum of cooling metal and the faint ticking of the dashboard clock, newly synchronized, but running a minute slow. I cut the ignition. The van's interior felt cavernous, hollowed out by the decision I had made, yet somehow lighter, as if the countless voices, the pleading messages, had lifted for a moment with the night. But then I noticed the rear window. At first, it was just the familiar bloom of condensation, an ordinary patchwork of breath and temperature. I reached to wipe it away, and my fingers found a hairline crack running from one corner to the other, a splintered vein that hadn't been there at the start of the night. Embedded within the fog, scrawled in uneven letters, a final message revealed itself. Thank you for remembering. Each letter trembled as if freshly written, and as I watched, the glass flexed just once and spidered further, tiny shards glinting in the gray morning light. I opened the back of the van, heart thumping, expecting perhaps that the body would be gone, or that something impossible would greet me in its place. But the gurney sat empty, the straps coiled neatly, the floor scrubbed clean. Nothing but a faint imprint where the coffin had lain. No sign of the name tag. No echo of my decision, except the odd feeling that I had closed a circle I never meant to start. In the administration office, the logbooks for the night showed my route as completed, but the record of the delivery was blank, overwritten in an old hand. No delivery, it read. My signature was there, but I didn't recall writing it, and the time was stamped at the precise minute the window cracked. My manager, when asked, only shrugged. He had no memory of my assignment, or even the body itself. To everyone else, the night was uneventful, ordinary. Only I seemed to know the truth. It would never fit in paperwork or confession. As days passed, I watched the van's rear window, waiting for more words or another message. But the fog lifted, and the crack never grew. For the first time in months, the van remained silent. The air inside grew warmer, and my own reflection, tired but unchanged, looked back at me. I wondered if the warnings would return, or if the next driver would see them, spelled out by unseen hands. Maybe the van, like the cemetery, simply waited for the right person to listen. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear a faint whisper when the road is empty and the mirror catches only darkness behind me. A thank you, a reminder, or a plea. I carry on, knowing the van has a memory of its own, and that some promises, once made, are never really left behind. The last message, etched in broken glass and mist, lingers long after the night is over. Story 7. On a gray Tuesday, as a thin fog clung to the old gravestones and the morning wind circled the empty lanes, I was called once again to the southern edge of the cemetery, a section most had forgotten. A stone chapel built before electric lights, before even asphalt reached this far out. They said a family wanted an old-fashioned wake, candlelit, no modern music, just silence and memory. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the hush. The stained glass above the altar filtered the daylight into a steady golden glow, never growing brighter, never fading, as if the sun itself paused just to watch. I checked my watch, then my phone minutes seemed to pass, but the light didn't shift, and outside, the fog held fast. The bouquets on the casket's lid, red and white lily, were fresh and moist, but after half a day, their petals hadn't wilted nor dropped a single leaf. It was as if the room was sealed away from weather, time, and even decay. When I touched the petals, they were cool and soft, dew clinging to their edges, and the scent hung in the air as if the flowers had just been delivered. The candles on every pew, set out by trembling hands the night before, burned at the same height by evening as they did at dawn, never needing to be replaced. The old wooden clock in the foyer ticked, but the hands hovered forever at 11:17. A minute before noon or midnight impossible to tell. I made rounds, tidied pedals, straightened hymnals, all the tasks a caretaker knows by rote, but each pass left the room unchanged. The same ribbons on the wreaths, the same gentle dust on the altar, the same prayer card tucked beneath the candlesticks. No breeze stirred, no insects slipped through the cracks, no sign that the world outside continued on at all. As the day stretched, I waited for the usual slow collapse of the ceremony, the drooping of blooms, the burn of wax-down glass, the restless shuffle of chairs, but here everything lingered. No one grew tired, the air never cooled, and the sounds from outside the chapel were muffled, distant, like a memory almost forgotten. Time was thick here, slow as honey, refusing to move forward. I didn't question it at first. Funerals are strange things, and grief is a slow hourglass. But as night crept in and the golden glow never faded, as the same light stayed locked on the casket and Lilla refused to bow to gravity or days gone by, I realized I might be waiting for something that would never end. A vigil stretched into eternity in a chapel where time itself had been left outside with the fog. It took me a few days, though I couldn't truly say how many, for my wristwatch stopped ticking after the second dawn inside the chapel, to realize that the faces seated in the pews were always the same and always arranged in the same precise way. Every morning, as I unlocked the doors and entered to check on the arrangements, I'd find the same man in the charcoal suit, with his silver hair neatly parted, his eyes red-rimmed but dry, sitting nearest the aisle. The same woman with a black hat and lace veil in the front row, clutching a pressed handkerchief she never used, her hands trembling with an anxiety that never turned to tears. There were children too, 2 of them, hair neatly combed, shoes shining as if polished anew each hour, their solemn faces frozen in the quiet anticipation of adults who never answered their questions. They would rise and sit with the same measured choreography, reciting prayers in gentle, unwavering voices. Rest eternal grant unto them, O Lord. Always the same liturgy, never skipping a word, never stumbling, no matter how many times I listened. Sometimes I tried to catch their eyes, to see if there was a flicker of recognition or fatigue, but their gazes would slide through me, alight and distant. They neither acknowledged my presence nor the passing of time, and they never seemed to notice the world outside growing darker, lighter, and darker again. Whenever a prayer finished, the room would fall into a silence, so complete it pressed against my ears like a heavy cloth. No shuffling, no whispered condolences, no coughs or sighs, just stillness. And then, as if on cue, one would begin the next reading, a gentle call and response that echoed off the stone walls and drifted up into the cold, unmoving air above our heads. The words never changed, not even once. I grew to expect every inflection, every pause, every soft amen. At times I tried to break the pattern, walking between the pews or rearranging the prayer books, but their rhythm remained unchanged, unbroken. Days bled into nights, or so I guessed, for the sky never shifted beyond the pale gold glow of that frozen stained glass. New faces never appeared at the door. No flowers were added to the ones on the casket, and none were taken away. Each gathering began and ended in the same way, though it never truly began, nor truly ended. The mourners were as much a part of the chapel as the lily that refused to wilt, and as the ritual looped again and again, I felt the walls closing in, the familiar comfort of routine mutating into a subtle horror, a ceremony without time, or closure, or escape, where every word spoken had already been spoken, and every tear held back had already been shed somewhere, long ago, in a world that no longer touched this place. In the quiet lull between the recited prayers, I often found myself staring at the casket stationed at the front of the chapel, always resting upon the same heavy wooden stand draped in an immaculate white cloth. At first, I followed my normal routine, checking that everything remained dignified, no creases in the shroud, the flowers undisturbed, the candle at its head replaced each day, though the flame never seemed to burn lower. Each morning, I'd roll the gurney beside the casket, clipboard in hand, ready to process the transfer to the grave site as outlined on the schedule that no longer matched the hours or days outside these stone walls. The instructions, though dutifully written, faded into irrelevance. The casket never moved. Every time I tried to wheel it away, something interfered. The stand would not budge. Once, as I attempted to lift one side, my hand slipped on a surface suddenly slick with condensation, though the air remained dry and cold. On another day, when I brought 2 groundskeepers to help, the wheels of the gurney jammed in grooves that hadn't been there before, and the hinges on the chapel doors refused to open despite all our efforts, the key turning uselessly in the lock. Sometimes, as I wrapped my fingers around the handles and braced to lift, I'd feel a chill pulse through my palms, a sensation that lingered long after I let go. There were occasions I wondered if I imagined at all. Maybe the casket was lighter or heavier, or perhaps it was empty. Once, gathering courage, I tried to open the lid to check, but the clasp seemed welded shut, and the mourners behind me offered no reaction, their hands folded, their gazes fixed elsewhere. It was as if the casket was a prop in a play that could never end, an object of perpetual mourning with no burial to conclude its story. The weeks, if they were weeks, wore on, and the same lily rested atop the lid, eternally fresh, their fragrance hovering on the air in a way that was both comforting and oppressive. I began to dread the ritual of preparing for a burial that would never take place. Each evening, as the chapel fell into silence and the candles continued to burn with unwavering light, I'd find myself lingering near the casket, listening for any hint of change, a creak in the wood, a shift in weight, a sigh of release from within. But nothing ever changed. The casket was always there, untouched and unclaimed by time, and every attempt to move it only led me back to my original position, as though I'd been rewound to the start of an endless loop, forever rehearsing the final act of a funeral that would never find its end. At first, my efforts were subtle, almost tentative, as if I feared offending the gravity of the place, or the silent mourners who filled the benches day after day. I began by snuffing out the candles that lined the altar, watching the smoke curl up and disappear into the rafters, expecting at least a small shift in the atmosphere, some hint that the cycle was breaking. Yet the next morning, before sunrise, every wick burned strong again, untouched, the scent of melting wax settling thick in the air as if mocking my intrusion. The lily on the casket never faded, never shed a single petal, and even when I tried to move the bouquet or replace it with new flowers, my offering would vanish, and the original blooms reappeared, as fresh as they'd ever been. Frustration set in, compelling me to test the boundaries more boldly. I swapped the funeral shroud for a different cloth, a plain cotton sheet with my initials sewn in the corner. The following day, the old embroidered cover was back, immaculate, its hem trailing over the stand just as it always had. Once, I gathered every guest book and condolence card, locked them in my office, and returned to find duplicates placed neatly on the entrance table, each page filled with familiar messages written in handwritings I recognized as my own, but dated from years I hadn't yet lived. The guests themselves seemed impervious to change. I tried to rouse them from their trance, calling out, tapping them on the shoulder, even blocking the aisles to force acknowledgement. But their eyes would pass through me, and their lips kept moving in that ceaseless prayer, the same lines looping, word for word, no matter the hour. On the bravest morning, I physically tried to usher them from the chapel, gently leading a woman in a black hat toward the doors. She offered no resistance, but as soon as I turned away, she was back at her seat, hat straight, hands folded, lips moving in silence. It was as if time itself had no hold in this space, and nothing I did could shift the ritual by so much as a breath. One night, desperate, I propped open every window and door, to invite the outside in, hoping a gust of winter wind might disrupt the scene. The candles flickered for a heartbeat. The scent of snow crept in, but the chapel reasserted itself. The light stabilized, the chill retreated, and the doors shut quietly on their own. The next day, everything was precisely as I had first found it. The casket untouched, the mourners gathered, the flowers perfect, as though my rebellion had been a dream. It became clear that there was no breaking the cycle from within, no way to shatter the illusion with mortal hands or honest grief. The ritual was deeper than the hours I counted, or the actions I could perform, and with each failed attempt, the lines between guest and host, between living and dead, between memory and repetition blurred, until I could not say for certain where my will ended and the chapel's endless ritual began. The realization crept in slowly, like fog rolling in from the riverbank, cold and persistent, settling into the corners of my thoughts and refusing to disperse. I had long lost track of the days, of how many times I had crossed the threshold into the chapel, how many attempts I had made to halt the ritual, how many faces I had watched recite the same words with lips that seemed at once animated and utterly lifeless. Sleep became elusive. I would drift in and out of shallow dreams where the chapel ceiling stretched endlessly above me, and the echo of prayers rattled like dried leaves. Sometimes I awoke sitting in the pews myself, unsure when I had left the door, uncertain how I had arrived among the mourners. The first time it happened, I blamed exhaustion, but then it happened again and again. One afternoon, sunlight streaming through stained glass, I glanced into the polished surface of the casket lid as I adjusted a flower arrangement. A crowd of faces appeared behind me, reflected in the warped glass faces I had come to know, and yet never truly remembered. In the midst of them, my own face stared back, pale and drawn, eyes heavy with the same sorrow that weighed down the others. My breath caught. I spun around, searching for a familiar voice to assure me it was nothing, but the chapel was filled only with the relentless hush of prayers. I looked at my hands, at the black suit that was not quite the one I owned, but felt as if I had always worn it. A memory flickered at the edge of my mind. Wasn't I meant to be somewhere else? Wasn't there a life beyond this threshold? A world where time moved and seasons changed? I tried to recall the last funeral I had overseen, the last conversation I'd had with the living, the last morning that felt real. Each recollection slipped away like water between my fingers, replaced by the endless sameness of lily and candlelight, the weight of tradition, the comfort and terror of routine. On the altar, the guest book lay open to a page with my name, signed in the same neat script as the others. The date blurred, as if it waited for a final detail that would never arrive. As I rose to leave the bench, intending to break free once and for all, I found my legs wouldn't carry me to the door. Instead, I settled into the familiar rhythm of the ceremony, lips parting to murmur the old prayers, joining the chorus that never ends. Around me, the faces glowed with that odd, otherworldly light, neither joyous nor mournful, simply present. In that moment, it became clear I was no longer merely a caretaker of this chapel or an observer of its mysteries. I was one of them, part of the ceremony, a thread woven into the endless tapestry of remembrance, repeating the ritual forever until another lost soul took my place in the circle, and I faded gently into the background of this unending funeral. Story 8. That night, the silence in the break room was thicker than usual, as if the new moon had weighed down the whole cemetery with a strange hush. The old wall clock, a yellowed relic with ornate hands and numbers fading to ghostly outlines, hung just above the coffee maker. Its steady ticking had always been background noise to the Covero's midnight routine. He'd grown so used to the sound that the absence would have startled him more than its persistence. But it wasn't absence that drew his attention tonight. He was stirring a cup of black coffee, half watching the sweep of the second hand, when he realized the minute hand was moving the wrong way, inching backward in smooth, deliberate ticks, dragging the hour hand with it. The time 3:28 became 3:27, then 3:26, and so on, the numbers unspooling the night instead of carrying it forward. At first, he thought he was overtired. The others noticed too. There was a growing lethargy in the air, a heaviness that made limbs ache and eyelids droop, as if every backward minute sucked a little more warmth from the room. Someone muttered a joke, must be Mercury in retrograde, but no one laughed. Each time the clock reversed, a chill passed through the group. People became quieter, conversation trailing into silence. Someone would stand to go check a grave record, only to pause mid-thought, momentarily unsure of what they'd meant to do. The veteran Coviro watched, uneasy, as the clock unwound the small hours, and with each minute that ticked back, he felt as though memories and intentions were being gently plucked from his mind. It was an odd, sticky confusion. He would start to recall a story from years ago, only for it to vanish before he could finish the thought. Even the names of coworkers, the men and women who had eaten lunch at his side for years, seemed to hover just out of reach, like details from a fading dream. He thought of getting up to check the clock's battery or see if someone was playing a prank, but his legs felt too heavy, and a drowsy unease made it easier just to watch. The night dragged on, the world outside holding its breath. The hands of the clock ticked ever backward, time unraveling itself, and in the corners of the break room, the shadows seemed to flicker and pulse in time with the backward minutes. By the time the first birds began to stir outside and the sky lightened at the windows, the clock had returned to its starting place. The Coviro blinked, as if waking from a long sleep, the weight in his limbs slow to leave. Around him, the others shook off the same sluggishness, but nobody spoke of the clock, nor the way their memories felt oddly thin, brittle in places, as if something important had been quietly, irrevocably taken during the slow rewind of the night. In the weeks that followed, the strange backward movement of the old clock became a private superstition among those who spent their nights in the cemetery's shadow. Every new moon, as if pulled by a force no one dared name, the hands would begin their silent reversal. With each retrograde sweep, a hush settled more thickly over the break room. Conversation died out earlier. Sometimes someone would ask a question: where did we leave the ledger? Who covered the Johnson plot last week? And no one could answer with confidence. At first, they tried to laugh it off, blaming the fatigue of night shifts and the monotony of routine. But inside, a quiet dread grew. The veteran Coviro, who had always kept careful notes on every burial and repair, found pages in his notebook scrawled with gaps, as if he'd forgotten what to record. On those nights, small things vanished from their collective memory. The color of a regular mourner's scarf, the exact sequence of funerals held last Monday, the first name of a colleague who'd worked there for years. The clock seemed to eat the edges of memory as it unwound time, and what remained was hollowed out and uncertain. More disturbing were the dreams that filled the blank spaces left behind. The Coviro sometimes awoke from brief, fitful naps, convinced he'd just been talking to a friend who no longer worked there. Except, when he tried to remember the face, all he could picture was an empty chair. The younger workers shrugged it off at first, but after a few cycles, even they spoke in whispers, asking if anyone else remembered details that didn't add up. The manager, whose name the Coviro noticed with a start he could no longer recall, began misplacing his own reports, as if the hours themselves were dissolving information, letting only fragments remain. One night, during a new moon so dark, it felt like the cemetery had been swallowed whole. The clock's hands spun faster. The sense of being drained grew so heavy that the Coviro almost fell asleep sitting upright. He forced himself to focus, to cling to the memory of the day's work, but it slipped from his mind like fog. He tried to recite the list of current staff, only to find half the names missing. When the clock's hands finally shuddered back to midnight, a sharp, metallic coldness prickled his skin. He looked around and realized, with a jolt of fear, that the faces around him were fewer than before. Yet he could not say, for certain, who was missing. Only that there should have been more chairs occupied, more voices in the room, and that with each backward sweep of the clock, the world he knew grew smaller, quieter, and somehow lonelier. By the third month, the ritual of the new moon and the backward-turning clock had woven itself into the unspoken rhythm of the cemetery's night crew. With each cycle, a peculiar anxiety hung in the air, not just the unease of graveyard shifts, but the oppressive knowledge that when the clock finished its reverse sweep, someone always failed to report for duty. At first, there were mundane explanations: a sick call, a family emergency, a resignation no one remembered being discussed. Yet as the weeks blurred and the night crew dwindled, the excuses grew brittle and strained. The Coviro found it increasingly hard to recall the names and faces of those who were no longer there, as if their absence had always been the case. In the lounge, lockers once filled with work boots and coats stood empty, but no one could say to whom they belonged. Each time the clock completed its anti-clockwise loop, the Coviro would feel a wave of dizziness, a brief and bitter chill, as if a draft had slipped through an open crypt. The next morning, he would wander the corridors and realize a favorite mug was missing from the kitchen. A set of tools had vanished from the shed. A voice that once joked or sang off-key no longer echoed through the halls. He would reach for the attendance roster, only to find it rewritten one fewer name, with the remaining entries looking as if they'd always been there and no one else. Sometimes he found himself standing before a faded staff photo, certain that someone had stood between him and the others, but the gap was now blank, the memory erased and overwritten. As the phenomenon persisted, the other workers stopped talking about the disappearances. It was easier to pretend the team had always been small, always this tired, always this quiet. Yet in the dead of night, the Coviro caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, a figure slipping into the fog behind a mausoleum, or a silhouette standing near the old clock, indistinct but undeniably present. Once, as the clock's hands reversed with a silent, inexorable certainty, he felt a hand on his shoulder, cold and familiar. But when he turned, there was only the empty room and the tick-tick of time unraveling itself. On some nights, he wondered if he would even notice when his own turn came, if the others would feel his absence, or if he would simply dissolve into the hollow quiet, leaving nothing behind but an empty chair and a name fading from a page. The clock continued to spin, and with each new moon, the world inside the cemetery shrank a little more, one life at a time, erased by the relentless backward sweep of hours. When dawn crept over the cemetery after each new moon, the Coviro's first act, more out of dread than duty, was to check the registry. There, in the pale blue light filtering through the office window, he would find a new name added to the official list of the dead. It was always someone from the crew, written in the same careful hand that filled every page, though he could never recall being the one to write it. The date of death was always the night just ended, marked by the new moon and the clock's backward spin. He would stare at the unfamiliar familiarity of each entry, sometimes only a surname, sometimes a full name, occasionally a nickname whispered around the break room. Yet the more he read, the more the names began to blur, merging with names of those already buried in the cemetery, as if the registry were recording not just deaths, but disappearances from memory itself. He noticed that the photographs on the walls changed as well. A group shot from last year, taken at the staff barbecue, now had fewer faces, each missing person seamlessly removed, leaving the remaining group crowded together, as if that was how it had always been. He rummaged through old shift schedules, only to find them altered, the handwriting uniform and official, the list of employees concise and clean, with no corrections or crossouts to betray that anyone had ever come and gone. In rare moments of clarity, he would recall the laughter of a colleague who no longer existed on any form, or the favorite jacket that once hung in the hallway, now vanished with no trace. Sometimes, late at night, he'd feel compelled to write his own name at the bottom of the registry, half in fear and half in resignation. Yet when he returned in the morning, the ink would be dry and unfamiliar, as though someone else's hand had guided his. It was as if the clock's reverse journey didn't just steal people from the present, but from the entire history of the place, erasing them so thoroughly that only the Coviro rooted to his lonely rounds remembered that anything had ever changed. He began to dread the new moon, to count the hours until the clock's hands reversed, each backward tick a warning that the line between the living and the dead, the remembered and the forgotten, was blurring further with every cycle. Each new name on the list was a silent marker, a gravestone carved not in earth but in memory, as the cemetery's story quietly rewrote itself around a shrinking cast of survivors. The realization came slowly, creeping in like a damp chill that never left his bones. With each new moon, the ritual of the clock's reverse ticking accelerated, the interval between disappearances shrinking, the breaks in memory widening, until even the layout of the cemetery seemed to shift and warp around him. The break room felt cavernous, its laughter now only a dull echo. The registry grew thinner. The walls were lined with photographs in which only his own face remained at the gates. Beside a grave, in front of the chapel, his expressions blurring from one picture to the next, as if even the images could not remember who he had been on each of those vanished days. He grew desperate, setting alarms and scribbling reminders on scraps of paper, hoping to outpace the erasure. He tried to destroy the clock, to take it from the wall and smash its glass beneath his boot, but each time the object reappeared, whole and ticking, by the following night. He taped over the hands, unplugged every electrical device, sealed the office, and watched the door. But nothing stopped the relentless, backward sweep of the minute hand when the new moon rose. In those nights, he barely slept. The cemetery seemed to pulse with a quiet tension, every grave humming as if the earth itself remembered more than he could. On the last cycle, the sense of inevitability was overwhelming. As midnight passed, he sat alone at the desk, the clock's hands spinning counterclockwise, the seconds dissolving like grains of sand slipping back up the glass. He listened to the silence and felt a familiar exhaustion settle over him. The registry lay open before him, blank except for a single waiting line at the bottom of the page. His hand trembled as he gripped the pen, but he couldn't remember whose name he was supposed to write. Was it his? Had it always been his? For a long moment, he just stared, hoping for the memory of a voice, a story, a face, anything to prove he was not already gone. When the first rays of light stretched over the headstones, he found himself still seated at the desk. The clock on the wall no longer ticked, its hands frozen, both pointing straight down, as if the day had ended for good. There were no other names left in the ledger. No footsteps sounded in the hallway. No laughter or greetings from the morning crew. He rose and walked the cemetery's empty lanes, passing graves whose markers he could not read, until he came to a fresh plot unmarked, open, waiting. He understood, finally, that this shift would never end for him, that he was now part of the cycle, the caretaker of lost hours and forgotten names, trapped in a time that ran backward forever. And as he gazed at the grave, he wondered if the world outside would ever notice that another keeper had disappeared, or if when the clock turned once more, there would simply be one less story to remember. Story 9. My first real assignment in the old section of Oak Ridge came at the end of September, just as the light started thinning out before 5 and the cold crept into your boots long before midnight. I'd worked there long enough to know that every cemetery has its own rhythm, and the older parts, the ones with crumbling iron fences swallowed by roots and stones, so weathered you could barely read a name, moved to a slower, heavier beat. The ground felt softer underfoot. The air seemed thick with the quiet that only comes when decades pass and nobody visits. Nobody remembers, and even the birds keep their distance. When the supervisor handed me the key to the old maintenance shed and told me to rake leaves and clear debris from the farthest corner, I felt that mixture of annoyance and reluctant pride that comes with being trusted for the lonely jobs. I loaded my barrow with the usual rake, gloves, some trash bags, a spray bottle of bleach for the lichen that crawled over everything, and set off past the new graves, past the family plots still watched by plastic flowers and faded pinwheels, until the gravel path thinned to mud and moss. The air grew colder with every step. The trees leaned close, and the fences out there were more rust than iron, twisted into strange shapes by time and storms. I worked in silence, the only sound the steady scrape of my rake through old leaves, the occasional snap of a brittle branch, the distant call of a crow that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. Most of the stones had lost their inscriptions entirely, but here and there I'd catch the curve of a letter or the shadow of a date, and each one felt like the last whisper of a story long since faded from any living memory. I'd nearly filled my first bag when I noticed a stone near the back wall, half swallowed by ivy, the marble dull and cracked, but just legible if I leaned close. The name Edward G. Howell, 1886 to 1933, meant nothing to me. There were no flowers, no coins, no tokens of remembrance, just a thick pelt of moss and, resting square in the middle of the stone, a gold ring so bright it seemed to pulse in the gray light. I stared at it for a long moment, certain it hadn't been there when I passed earlier. Gold like that should have caught the sun, even through the clouds, but it looked untouched by time or weather. It was simple, almost old-fashioned, but heavy for its size, with a pattern of leaves etched along the edge. My first thought was some visitor, maybe a child or an old woman, had left it by mistake, some private gesture that should be turned in before it disappeared. I hesitated before picking it up, an odd chill tracing down my wrist as soon as my skin met the metal. For a second, I felt as if someone was watching me from just behind the trees, and every sound in the world seemed to muffle. I slipped the ring into my jacket pocket, wiped my hands on my jeans, and tried to shake off the sense that I'd broken some unspoken rule. The rest of my shift moved slower after that. I kept glancing back at the stone, half expecting to see a figure standing there, or the ring back where I'd found it, but there was nothing, just the creeping dark, the deepening cold, and my own breath curling out in nervous little clouds. By the time I finished for the day, the ring still felt heavy in my pocket, warm now, almost pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I told myself it was just another lost object, another story added to the quiet hoard of forgotten things that every cemetery collects. Before I locked up, I handed it to the supervisor, explaining where I'd found it, expecting maybe a story about some absent-minded mourner or an old trick the groundskeepers played on new hires. He just nodded, slipped it into an envelope, and dropped it in the drawer marked Lost and Found. All evening I felt the weight of that gold pressing on me, even though it was gone, as if I'd brought something home that I couldn't quite put down. That night I dreamed of names I couldn't read, and voices speaking softly through the earth, calling for something they'd lost and weren't ready to let go. I arrived early the next morning, the kind of pale gray dawn where even the dew seemed reluctant to leave the ground, expecting nothing out of the ordinary beyond the usual routine bags to empty, paths to clear, maybe a quick sweep of the lost and found box if anyone came looking for what they'd left behind. I barely thought of the ring until I made my rounds through the old section again, pausing almost by habit near Edward Howell's grave, where the moss had begun to curl back after yesterday's scrubbing. And there it was, the same gold ring, resting exactly where I'd first seen it, shining bright as a drop of sun against the dull marble, right at the center of his name. For a moment I just stared, waiting for my mind to catch up, certain there had to be some mistake. I walked back to the office, half expecting to find the envelope where I'd left it in the drawer, but when I checked, it was gone. The supervisor was as puzzled as I was, swearing he hadn't opened the lost and found since I'd handed him the ring the night before. Maybe, he suggested, I'd simply forgotten, or maybe I was thinking of some other grave, some other object, and it was all just the tricks memory plays in old cemeteries. I took the ring again, heavier this time in my palm, and slipped it into my lunch bag, zipping it tight and locking it in my own locker for the rest of the day. That evening, I checked twice before leaving no sign of it on the grave, nothing unusual in my pockets. But when I returned the following morning, the routine already set in muscle and bone. The ring sat in its familiar spot on Edward's stone, as if it had never left. I tried to laugh it off, told myself it had to be some prank by one of the younger groundskeepers. But the look in their eyes when I asked, confused, a little wary, more than willing to steer clear of the old section altogether, made me doubt even that. Over the next week, I tried everything short of melting the damn thing down. I hid it in the janitor's closet, wrapped in rags beneath a pile of unused shovels. I sealed it in an envelope, tucked deep into a drawer I never opened. I even took it home once, pressing it into a box of old buttons and keys on my dresser, only to wake up the next day to a ringing phone and the supervisor's uneasy voice, asking if I'd come get my ring from Howell's grave, because it had shown up there again, perfectly clean, sitting just so, as if it had been waiting for someone to come. Looking, each time I touched it, a shiver worked its way down my arm, and each time I walked away, I felt a presence at my back, expectant, patient, the silence of the old graves thickening with a kind of watchful intent. I stopped telling anyone at work about it after the third time. There are things you learn to keep to yourself in this business. Little patterns and shadows that don't fit into any report or routine. Things you only speak of in the quiet, if at all. But the ring was always there, always waiting, no matter how many times I tried to remove it. A circle of gold that belonged to something or someone that wasn't done letting go. By the end of the second week, the ring had become less an object and more a presence. A kind of quiet certainty that waited for me in the farthest reaches of the cemetery's oldest corner, patient as a memory that won't die. I started to dread my rounds, but the habit was too strong to break. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that maybe, with help, I could end whatever trick or curse bound the gold to that forgotten grave. I enlisted Morris, one of the last old-timers left on staff, a man who dug more graves than anyone, and didn't spook easy. Together, we tried what reason and superstition could offer. We wrapped the ring in layers of canvas, sealed it in a small metal box, and locked it in the maintenance shed under 3 padlocks, logging the event in the workbook with the time, date, and both our names. The next morning, all locks were untouched, the box as we'd left it empty. On Howell's stone, the ring gleamed, its gold somehow untouched by the frost that lay on every other surface. We tried digging a shallow hole beneath an unmarked plot near the edge of the fence and burying the ring wrapped in salt and iron filings, something Morris swore would break unquiet ties. We watched together as the earth was filled in, the spot marked with a scrap of ribbon. The next morning, the grave was undisturbed, but the ring lay again atop Howell's stone, right where my hand would naturally reach to pick it up. It became a kind of silent contest after that, a battle of patience and will, but never of anger. Anger felt dangerous, like it would wake something best left sleeping. On a particularly wet evening, after a day of bitter rain, I tried one last desperate act. I carried the ring into town, dropped it in a dumpster behind the grocery store, and watched as the garbage truck hauled it away at dawn. I didn't sleep that night, waiting for a sign that the pattern had broken. But in the cold morning fog, the ring returned again, this time not only on the stone, but gently looped over the bone-white tip of a finger that protruded from the earth, as if the grave itself was tired of pretending. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at that hand, unmistakably human, curled slightly as though reaching for something, and the ring nestled perfectly around its bony knuckle. The ground was soaked, the earth loose and muddy, and for the first time I truly wondered if Howell, or whatever was left of him, would rise to claim what had always been his. Morris stood beside me, silent and pale, and neither of us spoke as I took the ring and buried the finger once more beneath a heap of wet moss. But even as the soil settled, I knew we changed nothing. The ring was bound to return, to mark the grave and whoever dared disturb it, and I began to suspect that the cemetery itself remembered and would not let us forget. The weeks dragged on in that slow, hollow way that only cemeteries and winter months can manage, and I found myself haunted less by the ring itself and more by the questions it pressed into every quiet moment. I couldn't let it rest. I started digging not in the earth, but in the brittle archives locked in the office's back room, thumbing through decades of yellowed ledgers and burial logs, hunting for any mention of Edward G. Howell or the ring that refused to leave him. The story that emerged was piecemeal and muddy, handed down through faded ink, and finally, in the cautious words of old Mr. Bell, a retired gravedigger who'd seen Oak Ridge through more storms and scandals than any file could hold. Howell, I learned, had not died in peace. The records showed disputes, bitter, drawn-out quarrels among relatives, arguments over property, debts, and most of all, that single piece of jewelry. The ring had belonged to him since youth, said to be a family heirloom, a symbol of loyalty, or maybe something darker. After his sudden death, no one wrote exactly how a fight erupted. Some wanted the ring buried with him, honoring a promise whispered at his bedside, while others claimed it should stay in the family, passed down as inheritance. It was said the undertaker gave in to pressure and removed the ring just before the lid was sealed, slipping it into the family's possession, while Howell's body lay unadorned beneath the damp autumn soil. From that day forward, odd things began to happen. Each anniversary, neighbors whispered about a light flickering in the cemetery, a shape bent over Howell's grave, the smell of earth and metal lingering in the air. Bell told me that the first time the grave was reopened for maintenance, the workers found the ring sitting atop the coffin, gleaming bright and unblemished. No one admitted to returning it. The family had moved away by then, leaving the grave to the weeds and time, but the story lived on among those who cared for the dead. Some called it a curse, others a failed promise, a last thread binding the restless to their loss. Bell leaned close as he spoke, voice trembling as if the story itself had weight. That ring don't belong to the living. It's his, always was. There are some things you return, or they find their own way home. The words sank into me, cold and certain. In that moment, the ring in my hand felt heavier than ever, humming faintly with a pressure that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath my boots. I looked at Howell's grave and understood that nothing I did no hiding, no burying, no denial would break what had been bound by death and regret. The ring was a promise broken and a debt unpaid, and every time I tried to remove it, I was only adding another layer to the story, another link in a chain forged from the stubborn memory of the earth and the silent will of the dead. The autumn storms rolled in fierce that year, rattling the windows and beating the old tin roof of the maintenance shed like a drum, calling up memories best left buried. For days, I wrestled with what to do. The ring's gold now as familiar to my touch as my own name, a cold circle that pulsed with a private gravity. There are nights in this work when the dead feel close, when the whole cemetery seems to breathe slow and deep around you. And on the worst of those nights, I knew it had to end. That evening, the sky boiled black with rain, lightning sketching skeleton branches across the stone rows, thunder shaking loose old soil from every corner. I waited until the downpour soaked through my coat, the wind carrying voices I refused to understand. I walked to Howell's grave with the ring clenched tight, its warmth uncanny against the shivering of my hands. No flashlight, no shovel, just a trowel and a quiet prayer I didn't know I still remembered. The ground was soft from days of water, the earth giving way with little resistance as I pressed aside the moss and traced the outline of the grave. I dug slow, mindful of every root and stone, until my fingers found the old layer of wood, crumbling but stubborn, just beneath the surface. I whispered an apology, not just for myself, but for everyone who had tried to steal, deny, or forget what belonged to Howell. I slipped the ring onto the brittle finger I found waiting, folding his hand gently over it. For a moment, the air seemed to sigh and still, as if the cemetery itself was watching. I covered the hand, replaced the moss, and smoothed the dirt, heart thudding with a heaviness I couldn't name. The rain eased as I stood, and a hush settled, so complete it felt as though the very stones had agreed to keep the secret. At dawn, I returned to find the grave cleaner than it had ever been in my years at Oak Ridge. No sign of the ring or of the disturbance. Only a single crow perched silent on the nearby fence. I wanted to believe it was over. But as I made my rounds that afternoon, a glint caught my eye across the cemetery, a silver locket, aged but unmistakably new, resting atop a grave that had stood empty for months. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of everything that had passed, and understood then that the earth keeps what it is owed, and the living are only ever guests here. Some attachments never die. They simply change hands, each new object waiting its turn to be remembered or returned by whatever rules the dead still keep. Story 10. The rain had come down harder than I'd seen in years, flooding the lowest corners of Oak View and turning every footpath to mud, hammering the tin roof above the tool shed until it felt like the world was shaking itself clean. I spent most of that stormy night listening to the wind rattle the window panes and the old elms bending and groaning under the weight of it, thinking only of how many branches I'd have to clear the next morning and whether any headstones had toppled in the gusts. I'd worked at the cemetery long enough to know that after a night like that, the whole place would feel different, as if the ground had shifted while we slept, rearranging old secrets beneath the surface. When I arrived at dawn, the air was still sharp and raw, carrying the smell of wet earth and broken leaves. Puddles glimmered in the morning light, stretching across the rows like tiny shallow graves, and the maintenance crew moved through the grounds in boots and raincoats, all of us silent, hands cold, each busy with the familiar ritual of storm cleanup. It wasn't until I'd nearly finished clearing debris from the north lot, where the grass always grows patchy and the stones lean in odd directions, that I noticed something out of place near the fence that borders the woods. There, running straight from the tangled thicket behind the property line and cutting through a patch of overgrown weeds, lay a narrow gravel path I'd never seen before. The stones were slick and gray, oddly pristine as if untouched by the night's flood, arranged too neatly to be the work of runoff or a careless wheelbarrow. It stretched for maybe 30 yards, bending away toward a dense stand of pine trees, then seemed to vanish into the brush, swallowed up by the green and shadow as though it had always been there, waiting. I knelt at the edge of the path, running my fingers through the stones. The gravel was clean, almost polished, and cold as river ice, unlike the sun-warmed gravel that lined our regular service road. I looked for tire marks or footprints, but found only the ghost of rainwater pooled between the rocks, as if the path had emerged fully formed in the hours after the storm. By the time the others gathered around, word had already spread among the crew. Someone had made a new road in the night, and nobody could say who. Old Ricky, who'd worked Oak View since the 70s, swore there had never been a path in that corner, not even before the new owners bought up the adjacent land and fenced it off. A few of the younger guys joked about buried treasure or secret exits, but no one was eager to follow the stones, not even out of boredom. There was something uneasy in the air, the way the birds refused to settle on the branches above the trail and the dogs from the houses. Down the lane barked all morning from behind their gates. The path didn't fit. It was as if the cemetery had grown a new limb overnight, and none of us could remember what the landscape looked like before it appeared. The rest of that week passed with the usual routine funerals, groundskeeping, paperwork, but the path lingered in the back of my mind. Sometimes I'd catch another worker, staring down its length as if waiting for it to lead somewhere familiar. But every time I looked, it felt like the gravel ran deeper into the woods. A little longer, a little darker, a line drawn by a hand that didn't belong to any of us. And when the first man disappeared, following the trail into the trees after his shift, I realized the cemetery had been changed by the storm in ways none of us understood. It was late on a Thursday, the kind of gray, heavy afternoon when even the crows seemed to keep their distance, and most of the crew had already called it a day. I was double-checking the back lot, making sure nothing had washed loose in the storm, when I saw Tom never one to ignore a mystery standing at the mouth of the new gravel path, shoulders hunched, hands buried in his jacket pockets. He'd always been curious, the sort who pokes at things just to see if they'll poke back, and that day was no different. He called out something about finding the end of the trail, offered a half-hearted grin, and before I could answer, he started walking, boots crunching on the stones as the path carried him out of sight. I kept an eye on my watch, expecting him back in a few minutes, maybe muddy and laughing, maybe with some story about a fallen tree or a stray animal spooked out of the brush. The minutes slipped by, 10, then 20, then more. The sun fell behind the clouds, and the cold crept in along the ground. I waited, trying to keep busy, but when nearly an hour had passed and there was still no sign of Tom, a knot of worry started to pull tight in my chest. I radioed the main office, then circled the area, calling his name into the thickening dusk, listening for any answer beyond the sigh of wind through the pine needles. At last, just as the sky dipped to that colorless slate before dark, Tom emerged from the shadows where the path disappeared into the woods. His hair was wet, his boots caked in fresh mud, and his face looked drawn, older somehow, like he'd aged a few years in the span of an afternoon. He didn't say a word at first, just stood at the edge of the path, blinking in the faded light, as if he'd stepped out of a dream he wasn't ready to leave behind. When I reached him, his hands were shaking, and his voice sounded hollow, thin as the autumn wind. He said he'd walked for what felt like hours, though by the clock it couldn't have been more than one. The world on the other side of the gravel shifted and folded in on itself, he whispered, thick fog rolling over tombstones he didn't recognize, the cemetery growing stranger the farther he went. But the strangest part, he said, was the figure he saw through the mist, a man working alone among the headstones, moving with the slow patience of someone who knew every name carved in stone. As Tom drew closer, the man turned, revealing a face almost identical to his own, only older, lines carved deep at the corners of his eyes, gray streaking his beard, the same battered cap pulled low on his brow. The older version didn't speak, just nodded and went back to his work, tending graves with the practiced hands of a man who'd never truly left the place behind. Tom ran then, stumbling back down the path, the gravel beneath his boots feeling heavier, the forest pressing in close, until suddenly he was at the edge again, blinking in the last scraps of daylight. He swore he hadn't been gone more than a few minutes, but his watch showed hours lost, time unaccounted for, the path behind him already beginning to fade into shadow. He refused to go near it after that, and in the silence between us, something in the air shifted, as if the cemetery itself was listening, waiting to see who would follow next. After Tom returned, nothing in the cemetery felt quite the same. Even those who hadn't witnessed his shaken silence sensed the change, a hush that spread from the back lot outward, making every footstep echo and every shovel scrape sound sharper, like the ground itself was holding its breath. At first, everyone avoided talking about the gravel path. We moved around it, gave it a wide berth with our carts and rakes, glancing sideways as if expecting to see something watching from the tree line. But word got around in the way it always does, passed in murmurs at the break room table and nervous glances over coffee. One of the newer men, Wallace, swore he'd seen Tom's shadow move independently of his own while Tom was gone, flickering on the wall like a memory that wouldn't settle. Another said the path looked longer every day, creeping closer to the old mausoleum at the back of the property. By Monday, the tension broke. Jenkins, stubborn and practical to the bone, announced he'd walk the trail himself. Maybe he thought it would put the rumors to rest, or maybe he just couldn't resist proving everyone wrong. He waited for a dry spell in the afternoon and strode out across the wet grass, boots snapping stones beneath him, his figure shrinking until the trees swallowed him whole. He didn't return for nearly 3 hours. When he did, he was pale and sweating. Mud crusted up his arms as if he'd clawed his way out of a ditch, and his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. When pressed, Jenkins mumbled about getting lost in a fog thick as wool, the kind that muffled sound and swallowed the light from his lantern. He described wandering among unfamiliar headstones, the names blurred or missing, the dates running backward, and then, there among the markers, seeing himself or something close. An older man, same build, same limp from an old knee injury, bent over a grave with Jenkins's own name on it, dusting leaves from the stone with methodical care. The older version glanced up, met Jenkins's eyes, and smiled, a small, sad smile, before disappearing into the mist. Jenkins barely remembered stumbling back, but when he checked his phone, his call log was filled with attempted numbers he never dialed, as if someone else had tried reaching out. After that, nobody wanted to be assigned the backlot. The crews shuffled the schedule, always finding a reason to trade shifts or work other corners of the cemetery. I started to notice the path never seemed to stay in the same place, sometimes curving a little more to the right, sometimes seeming to double back on itself, always damp no matter how long the sun shone. The older workers fell quiet, sharing wary glances, each of us wondering if we'd be next, if the path would one day call our names. The cemetery, once a place of routines and quiet sorrow, now hummed with a silent fear, as if the storm had left something behind that no one could bury, and the gravel path waited, patient and sure, to show us all the future we could not refuse. It became impossible to ignore the path after a while. I found myself staring at it in the early mornings, when the mist clung to the grass, and even the birds kept away, wondering what it wanted and why it hadn't yet chosen me. The stories haunted my dreams, Tom's hollow eyes, Jenkins's trembling hands, the whispers that passed between shifts. Each day I promised myself I'd stay away, but each day the path seemed to stretch a little closer to my routine, waiting at the edge of every task, every memory I tried to bury beneath the comfort of work. It was a cold, wet night when I finally gave in, the sky low and heavy, rain pattering on my shoulders as I made my rounds with the old flashlight and the ring of keys that had grown heavier with each season. The rest of the crew had left early, blaming the weather or family, or just a sense that it was time to go, and I was alone except for the feeling that something out there was keeping count. I reached the mouth of the path and paused, heart thumping in my throat, the gravel shining in the beam of my light like 1,000 tiny mirrors, each one reflecting a piece of a life spent among the dead. With every step I took, the cemetery behind me grew fainter, the trees closing in tight, the world narrowing until the only sound left was the crunch of stone beneath my boots and the slow, careful breathing that I had to remind myself was mine. Fog crept up from the ground, cold and thick, swirling around my knees, erasing the familiar order of graves and footpaths. A flashlight struggled to cut through the gloom, the beam bouncing off headstones I didn't recognize. Their names faded, their shapes wrong, as if the cemetery itself had been taken apart and put back together by memory alone. The air grew heavier, sweet with the scent of wet earth and old flowers, and every instinct I had told me to turn back, to pretend the path had never appeared, but I pressed on, stubborn or foolish, or just tired of being afraid. I lost track of time, of distance, even of my own thoughts, everything shrinking down to the circle of light at my feet and the certainty that I was not alone. Then I saw him, a man bent over a grave, moving with the practiced patience of years spent among sorrow, wiping moss from a headstone that caught the pale glow of my flashlight. He wore my coat, my cap, walked with the same limp I'd picked up 2 winters ago, shoveling snow, and when he straightened, he looked at me with eyes that were my own but older, deeper, threaded with the quiet grief of 1,000 funerals. He smiled, not unkindly, and nodded once, then turned back to his work, humming a tune I hadn't heard since childhood. I wanted to speak, to ask if he was real or just another memory the rain had dredged up, but the words dried up on my tongue. I watched as he laid a flower on the stone and disappeared into the mist, leaving me alone in a place that felt at once impossibly old and sharply new. The flashlight flickered, the fog pressed in, and I stumbled back down the path, each step heavier than the last, the gravel cold and sure beneath my feet. When I finally saw the familiar trees and the shed's faint outline, I realized I'd been gone much longer than I could believe, and my hands trembled with the knowledge that I had seen not just a version of myself, but perhaps the end of all roads that begin and end in this place. The world felt different when I came back through the thinning mist, the familiar rows of headstones blurring into view beneath the pale wash of security lights. Everything too still, too sharp, as if I were seeing the cemetery for the first time or the last. My watch had stopped somewhere in the fog, the hands frozen at midnight, and when I checked the clock in the maintenance shed, hours had passed though. The memory of the walk was as brief and jagged as a dream. Mud caked my boots and streaked my cuffs, but what unsettled me most was the cold ache in my joints, an unfamiliar heaviness in my fingers, as if I'd aged decades with every step on that path. I scrubbed my hands at the sink until the skin burned, half expecting to find them cracked and withered like the hands of the old man I'd seen among the graves. The next morning, Tom and Jenkins both glanced at me sideways, as if recognizing something they wished they could forget. No one spoke of the path, but all of us felt its presence now, lurking at the edges of our routines, tugging quietly whenever we looked away. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. A tuft of gray at my temple that hadn't been there before. A habit of humming the same tune I'd heard from my older self. The feeling of being watched as I cleaned leaves from stones or straightened a marker half lost to the grass. Sometimes, as dusk crawled over Oakview and the last visitors hurried out, I would glimpse a shape moving at the far edge of the cemetery, stooped and slow, tending the forgotten graves with hands that looked achingly familiar. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the failing light or the memory of that night clinging to my nerves. But deep down I understood the truth I'd brought back from the path. The cycle was patient, old as the stones beneath my feet, and every caretaker who tried to unravel its secret only became another thread in its endless pattern. I saw the path after every storm, twisting a little differently each time, and each time I looked at it, I felt the quiet certainty that one day I would walk it again, not out of fear or even curiosity, but out of duty, knowing that some roads in this place lead only to ourselves, and the future waits for us among the graves, silent, watching, always ready to hand us the tools we once carried for the dead.